Chapter 506. Battalion Commander Kong Chuanxin was in the middle of the troops. Seeing the 20,000 Jiaoji soldiers closing in, his expression did not change. If one looked closely, one could see a trace of disapproval in his eyes. It wasn't because Kong Chuanxin was careless. Before he came, Yang Chendong had talked to him and told him about the iron shield that was being built in Hanoi City. This was all thanks to the Security Bureau. After being injected with large amounts of gold and silver, the Security Bureau had developed so quickly that they had already infiltrated the countries that they were pretending to be enemies with. Once there was any movement, they would immediately spread the news so that the main force of the mercenaries could make the most accurate decision. As someone who came later, no one knew better than him the importance of intelligence. Later on, people said that victory in a war depended on the source of military intelligence. Some people even said that 70% intelligence and 30% battle. This showed the importance of military intelligence to an army. It was because he was prepared that Yang Chendong told Kong Chuanxin about the Jiaoji army building the iron chariots when Kong Chuanxin was about to lead the army into battle. Not only that, he also came up with a countermeasure. The advantage of the steel shields was their sturdiness. They could indeed effectively block flying bullets. However, their weaknesses were even more obvious. For example, they were slow and inflexible. With these shortcomings, it was naturally very easy to deal with them. All they needed to do was throw a series of grenades, and it would be like a heavenly maiden scattering flowers. In this way, unless the place was very narrow, facing the fragments of the explosion in all directions, even an iron shield would be useless. As for the steel chariots? Regardless of whether it was a rocket launcher or a 4-0 flame, they would all be easy targets. Thinking about the battlefield in the future, even mobile tanks were afraid of rocket launchers, not to mention the clumsy steel chariots that relied on their legs to move. Kong Chuanxin, who had received the news ahead of time, didn't show the slightest hint of panic when he saw Iron Shield approaching him step by step. The only thing he was worried about now was whether Tiansu could keep the situation under control. After all, there was a limit to how far a grenade could be thrown. Whether or not the mercenaries at the front could withstand the pressure from the Jiaoji army and strike at the most appropriate time was the most important factor in this first battle. Tiansu was the company commander of Company 1, and was the subordinate that Battalion Commander Kong Chuanxin valued the most. As the mercenary group continued to expand, the number of mid-level officers needed also increased. Promoting new recruits was something that Yang Chendong had always advocated. Under what circumstances would one be able to tell if a person's military talent was worthy of being entrusted with important tasks? Without a doubt, war was the best battlefield and way to test a commander. Kong Chuanxin wanted to test the ability of the company commander of heavenly strategies, so he didn't say a word from beginning to end. He just watched everything from the perspective of a bystander. Of course, if heavenly policy was really useless, then the second company commander, third company commander, and fourth company commander could replace him at any time. This was also something Kong Chuanxin had prepared behind the back of the heavenly policy. He believed that even if the company commander of heavenly strategies found out about this, he wouldn't be dissatisfied. After all, the situation on the battlefield was always ever-changing. A commander who didn't leave any room for maneuver was the most unprofessional. How would the company commander of heavenly strategies know about this? After ordering a company of subordinates and a battalion of auxiliary soldiers to prepare grenades, he raised his Type 95 and fired a shot at the Jiaoji soldiers in front of him. Bah! The sound of the gunshot was extremely crisp. The bullet flew out of the barrel of the gun and hit a Jiaoji soldier's shield according to Heavenly Strategy's plan. Under the sound of the iron weapons colliding, an even more crisp sound of collision was produced. When the gunshot rang out, Ruan Gengwang's eyes widened. His expression was somewhat unnatural. Although the Crown Prince had said that these shields were made of pure metal and that firearms shouldn't be able to penetrate them, he still lacked confidence because he hadn't tested it before. When the gunshot rang out, his entire body tensed up. All of this lasted until the bullet hit the metal shield and produced a spark. Only then did he heave a huge sigh of relief. Then he pointed to the front with a smile and said to his subordinates, "Do you see that? The opponent's firearms are useless against us." Ha! The group of subordinates also laughed loudly as if they were in agreement. Previously, they were indeed a little nervous. Although they took the initiative to attack, their morale was astonishing. However, before they encountered firearms, they really didn't have confidence in their hearts. Now it was all good. The truth allowed them to relax. Not only the generals, but the soldiers below Yeshen were also frightened by this shot. However, when they saw that the troops in front of them didn't show any signs of chaos or uneasiness, these people also let go of their courage. When they shouted the word, "Advance," their voices were much louder and their speed was much faster. As expected, it's made of pure metal. Amazing! After firing the shot, Heavenly Strategies retracted the Type 95 and shook his head. Although he looked a little disappointed, he wasn't afraid at all. Obviously, this result was within his expectations. The two troops were still closing in on each other rapidly. 400 meters, 300 meters, 200 meters. As they got closer and closer, both troops could clearly see each other's formation. A tense atmosphere began to spread. The emotions of war and killing were quickly condensed and focused. 150 meters, 130 meters, 100 meters. At such a distance, both sides could already see each other's figures and appearances. The archers of the Jiaoji army who were hiding behind the metal shields also prepared to fire their arrows. There were a total of 2,000 archers. One could imagine that if they didn't stop them, arrows would rain down from the sky. "Comrades, charge for 30 meters. Drop the bombs and shoot." His gaze was fixed on the enemy's every move. When he saw that the enemy was about to make the first move, Heavenly Strategies, who had been lazing around all this while, seemed to have changed into a different person. He suddenly roared and led the troops to charge forward. Heavenly Strategies' actions also led the soldiers beside him to charge forward as fast as they could. The Cold Vanguard Company and the Auxiliary Battalion, a total of 500 people, charged forward like arrows released from a bow. To the soldiers who had to run 25 kilometers in a day's training, the 30-meter distance was a sprint. In just a few seconds, they had crossed the required distance. Then, 500 grenades were tossed forward like rain. Under the 30-meter standing run, the flying speed of the grenades was much further than before. Basically, each grenade was thrown a distance of more than 60 meters. Under such superposition, the distance of 100 meters was covered in the blink of an eye. Before the Jiaoji army could react, including the 2,000 archers, they had just knocked their bows. Before they could release their arrows, the grenades that filled the sky rained down on their heads. What the hell is this? Many of the Jiaoji army instinctively had this question in their minds. However, just as this thought formed in their minds, the grenades that were thrown at them had already exploded above their heads, beside them, and under their feet. Boom, boom, boom. The ground trembled and shrapnel flew everywhere. Flames rose and smoke lingered in the air. Following these sudden changes, the formation of the 1,000 iron shield bearers at the front of the Jiaoji army finally loosened. These iron shield bearers were originally holding heavy shields. After walking for nearly 3 miles, they were already exhausted. Suddenly, there was a loud noise and shockwave around them. It was mainly due to the various fragments attacking them. They were completely unprepared and were struck dumb in an instant. They only wanted to defend against the firearms in front of them. They did not expect such powerful explosives to suddenly explode beside them. The iron shield bearers, who seemed to have the tightest defense, were the first to collapse. The 2,000 archers who stood behind them in the second row also fell into chaos. The advantage of archers was that they could kill their enemies from a long distance. However, their disadvantage was also very obvious. Once they lost their protective barrier, their chest would be completely exposed to the enemy. There was no way to defend themselves at all. Needless to say, the explosions of the grenades were right above their heads. Who knew how many archers were killed or maimed by the power of the grenades? After a row of iron shield bearers and 2 rows of archers were defeated, the entire Jiaoji army was in chaos. Surrounded by explosions and smoke, They did not even know what to do next. The Jiaoji army was stunned and their formation was in chaos. The mercenaries didn't panic. After throwing out the grenades, they started shooting with their guns. 500 people against 20,000 enemies. There was no need for them to aim. All they needed to do was to adjust the Type 95 and Type 81 assault rifles into continuous firing mode. Bullets continued to spray out from the muzzles of the guns, shooting towards the Jiaoji soldiers opposite them. Every time the machine guns fired, a group of Jiaoji army would fall to the ground. They did not understand the situation and did not know what was going on. Many of them fell to the ground with unknown emotions. Some of the Jiaoji army soldiers who were lucky enough not to be hit by the bullets turned around and ran. When people encounter danger, they will have an instinct. This instinct is to turn around and run away. Unless there was something even more terrifying happening behind them, they would run until they could not run anymore. Chapter 507. The initial moment was terrifying. There was nothing more pitiful than a group of panicking defeated soldiers. They scrambled to retreat. They shouted and ran, and many of them fell down. The Jiaoji soldiers who were shot didn't know what they were doing. They just instinctively retreated to the open city gate behind them. General Ruan Gingwang was in the middle of the army. Riding on a horse, he could see further than ordinary people. Naturally, he knew what had happened. The sudden explosion of the grenade was beyond his expectations. He had a bad feeling when he saw a large number of Iron Shield soldiers fall to the ground. However, before he could give the order, the entire army fell into chaos. Hold on. Charge forward. They have fewer people than us. As long as we charge forward, we can win. He shouted as he swung his sword at the retreating soldiers. He wanted to use this method to stop the army from retreating. However, under the fear of death, how many people would listen to his words? How many people would listen to him? But how many people would listen to it and take it to heart? The tide of retreating soldiers couldn't be stopped. Even though Ruan Gingwang had killed 4 to 5 retreating Jiaoji soldiers, he couldn't reverse the situation. Not only that, Ruan Gingwang, who was swinging his sword, became Tian's target. Riding on a horse and being higher than everyone else was a privilege of a general. However, at the same time, it was inevitable that he would become a conspicuous target. Tiansu targeted him. He held the 95 style firmly with both hands and raised the gun in a half-kneeling position. He adjusted his breathing and aimed between 3 points and 1 line. His finger gently touched the trigger of the gun. Then his shoulder shook. That was the recoil of the bullet. Bang, bang. In the chaos, no one paid attention to the 2 gunshots. However, after the first gunshot missed the target, the second gunshot hit the target. Ruan Gingwang, who was still swinging his sword and yelling at the retreating soldiers, felt a pain in his chest. Then, his breathing became hurried. His body swayed a little on the horse before he lost the strength to hold on to it and fell from the horse. Once a person fell, the consequences would be very serious. Ruan Gingwang, who had been shot, would not have died immediately. However, when he fell to the ground, countless feet stepped on his body. Not only did he not have a single breath left, but his entire face had also changed. At that moment, he was completely trampled to death. When Ruan Gingwang fell off his horse and died, it meant that the 20,000 Jiaoji soldiers had completely retreated. Without anyone stopping them, the Jiaoji soldiers were running wildly. Less than 100 meters behind them, 500 mercenaries with guns were chasing after them, killing the last few Jiaoji soldiers who were running away. This seemed to have become a death sentence. The speed of the fleeing soldiers chasing after Qiu Jiaoji became slower and slower. They were all afraid that if they were too slow, they would fall behind and be killed. Because of this, stampedes occurred from time to time. No matter who it was, once they lost their balance and fell to the ground, they would not be able to escape the tragic fate of being trampled to death. Behind the Heavenly Strategies Company commander, Battalion Commander Kong Chuanxin saw that the overall situation was settled and immediately shouted to the 3 trumpeters who had been waiting for a long time, "Blow the bugle, everyone attack." Beep 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 beep. The loud and refreshing bugle call sounded. Over 3,000 mercenaries gave a shout and charged forward. They maintained a platoon formation and tried their best to charge forward as fast as possible. The situation in front of them seemed to be telling them that if they were late by one step, who knew how many military merits they would lose. Compared to the full charge of the mercenaries, Crown Prince Li Yuanlong staggered on the city tower of Hanoi City. If it were not for the captain of the guards who supported him, he would have fallen to the ground. Defeated, defeated. Li Yuanlong had just stabilized himself when he muttered to himself, defeated, defeated. Your Highness, please close the city gates immediately. General Fan Yuhai's expression was also very ugly. Fortunately, he had led troops for many years and was not as weak as the crown prince. I agree. The other general, Huang Hua, also cupped his fist and said with his head lowered. Clearly, he could see that if this continued, the defeated Ruan Gengwang's troops would very likely attract the mercenaries into the city. Hearing the two generals express the same opinion, Li Yuanlong's face flashed with a hint of struggle. However, he quickly made a decision. He gritted his teeth and said, pass down this crown prince's order, close the city gates. With this order, it meant that the 20,000 Jiaoji soldiers outside the city had completely given up. Ruan Gengwang was dead and his subordinates were running like headless flies. They only hoped to enter Hanoi City as soon as possible and save their lives. However, what they saw next was the scene of the eastern city gate closing from the inside. Unpleasant creaking sounds came from the thick and heavy city gate as it rapidly closed. Seeing that their only escape route was about to be sealed, at least 10,000 Jiaoji soldiers' eyes turned red. Some people's eyes were filled with despair. Some people ran faster, hoping to rush into the city at the last moment. There were also people who ran towards the empty trebuchet. Then, everyone worked together to change the direction of the heavy trebuchet. Since they have already abandoned us, then don't blame us for using our own methods to fight back. A somewhat famous Chiliarch yelled and ordered the soldiers under him to put the huge rocks into the trebuchet. The trebuchet began to bombard Hanoi City behind them. As he bombarded the trebuchet, the Chiliarch yelled to the approaching mercenaries, "We surrender. We are willing to help you take down Hanoi City and atone for our crimes." With this yell, many Jiaoji soldiers quickly responded. In order to live, they had to show a stance. Stop firing! Company Commander Tian Su, who had already reloaded his fourth magazine, saw the change in the situation and immediately stopped the advancing mercenaries. Originally, he wanted to follow behind the Jiaoji soldiers into Hanoi City. This was also the military order he made in front of Battalion Commander Kong Chuanxin. However, when he saw the city gates close in advance, he became anxious. Although he still had a backup plan, it was still more troublesome. However, when he saw the sudden change in front of him, he suddenly had an idea. Why not use these defeated soldiers to help him take down the city? The 400 people beside him were all treasures. It would be best if he could save one of them. After making up his mind, Tian Su followed the situation and yelled, "Any Jiaoji soldiers who help the mercenaries take down the city will be atoned for their crimes and will not be killed. Anyone who still wants to resist will be killed without mercy." The 400 soldiers who were stopped by Tian Su didn't understand what he was planning. However, when they heard his yell, they all understood. In the following moment, they all followed Tian Su's lead and yelled, "Kill without mercy." Attacking was atoning for their crimes and atoning for their crimes. The Jiaoji soldiers who were already at their wits' end saw a sliver of opportunity before their deaths. How could they not grasp it with all their might? One by one, they ran to the catapults and began to help take down Hanoi City's city gate tower. These catapults were used to prevent the mercenaries from attacking. They were placed very close to Hanoi City's city gate tower, less than 50 meters away. Now that they were being used as tools to take down the city gates, one could imagine how big of a threat they were. When a random boulder was thrown, it actually flew over the city gate tower and landed in Hanoi City. Just this boulder alone was enough to harm countless innocent people in the city. Bastards, bastards! Release the arrows and kill them. Seeing these defeated soldiers helping the mercenaries against him, Crown Prince Li Yuanlong's expression turned ugly as he yelled at the top of his lungs. The crown prince had given the order. Although he knew that the people below were soldiers of his own country, seeing them throw boulders into the city and injure countless people, Fan Yuhai, Huang Hua and the other generals gritted their teeth and ordered fiercely, "Fire the arrows." After a few breaths, arrows rained down. For a moment, the battle outside the city was very lively. On the contrary, Commander Tian Su and the others who were following behind became less anxious. "Commander, should we lend a hand?" A platoon leader of the Lung Feng platoon couldn't help but ask when he saw the Jiaoji soldiers fighting with their own people so fiercely. "There's no need to hurry. Let's wait until their morale is low before we make a move." Not only did Tian Su speak unhurriedly, he even sat down on the ground to take a good rest during the battle. With Commander Tian Su taking the lead, the other 500 mercenaries also sat down on the ground. Each of them hugged their guns and looked at the lively scene 200 meters away, occasionally pointing at it. By the time Battalion Commander Kong Chuanxin arrived with his main force, this was the scene that greeted him. However, Kong Chuanxin didn't have any intention of reprimanding Tian Su. Perhaps he had the same thought. Therefore, he ordered his troops to take advantage of this time to take a good rest while calling someone to call Tian Su over. "That battle just now was pretty good. You showed the might of the Lung Feng platoon. What do you plan to do next?" Kong Chuanxin asked as he pointed at the flat ground beside him, indicating that Tian Su could sit down. Of course, Kong Chuanxin knew what to do. However, he still asked because he wanted to test Tian Su. As the mercenary army continued to grow, the ranks and structure of the troops also increased. It was only a matter of time before someone like him, who had military achievements and experience, rose to the top. However, if he wanted to secure a high position, it would depend on whether he had capable subordinates. Clearly, at this moment he was nurturing Tian Su as a trusted aide. Chapter 508. In front of Kong Chuanxin, Tian Su wasn't that restrained. After all, Kong Chuanxin was his squad leader when he first joined Lung Feng. When he became a squad leader, Kong Chuanxin was also his platoon leader. Along the way, he had a battalion commander and a company commander. Battalion commander, what I mean is that we should wait until they've exhausted most of their forces. Once they're tired, we'll blast open the east gate and take the opportunity to charge in. Tian Su said casually. This was part of the battle plan from before. During the meeting yesterday, Kong Chuanxin had said that if it was possible, they should attack Hanoi City today. If the conditions weren't right, then they would wait for the right opportunity. Although that was what he said, everyone who attended the meeting knew that the battalion commander was going to make a decision to make a great contribution. Unless the conditions were really unsuitable, the invasion of Hanoi City today was a fact that was set in stone. Aren't we being a little too hasty? Kong Chuanxin asked worriedly after hearing Tian Su's reply. According to the intelligence, there are 80,000 Jiaoji soldiers in the city. In addition, there are many high-ranking officials and nobles in the city. I'm afraid there are at least 10,000 of them in total. If we include the conscripts in the city, then there will be 100,000 soldiers. Even though we can eliminate 20,000 of them, there will still be a lot left. Attacking a country's capital with less than 3,000 people? Moreover, the enemy had already made some preparations for defense. Such a thing sounded like a joke. However, it was a completely different story when the same thing happened to the mercenaries. With their excellent military quality, excellent physical fitness, and most importantly, excellent weapons and equipment, it was normal for them to win a battle with a small number of people. Therefore, Kong Chuanxin wasn't worried about whether they could attack the city. Instead, he was worried about whether they could gain a foothold after entering the city. If they went in first and were chased out, then it would be really embarrassing. When the sixth young master arrived with the main force of the army, wouldn't they be too ashamed to meet him? Tian Su naturally understood this as well. Therefore, he nodded in agreement. Then, he said, "Battalion commander, riches and honor are found in danger. This time, you finally have the opportunity to lead the team alone. It would be a pity if you don't fight for it." Moreover, once they suddenly entered the city, the Jiaoji soldiers would definitely not be on guard, and the good stuff would not be transferred too much. That was a large batch of spoils of war. How much merit would that be? Presumably, the sixth young master would be very satisfied when he saw it. As for what will happen after we enter the city, we can just take it slow and steady. If it doesn't work, we can just burn down all the dangerous buildings in front of us. As long as the Jiaoji soldiers can't get close to us, they can't do anything to us. When the time comes, it will be time for us to use our guns to kill them one by one. Burn houses? Are you going to burn down the houses too? Hearing this idea, Kong Chuanxin's eyes lit up. However, when he thought about how the sixth young master often said that he wanted to get along well with the people, he couldn't help but hesitate. Seeing Kong Chuanxin's worry, Tianzi chuckled and said, "Battalion commander, the sixth young master is a kind person. It makes sense for him to advocate for unity and building good relations with the people. However, we are not facing the Han people, but the people of Jiaoji. Perhaps there are kind people among them, but most of them are still hostile to us. Moreover, a general's success is built on 10,000 years of withered bones. At this time, we can't have the slightest bit of kindness. Otherwise, we will be harming our own brothers." Tianzi's words were very reasonable. On the battlefield, only victory mattered. Only by winning would they be able to gain the initiative. Even if you want to benefit the people, Yes Hen has to have the final say. Otherwise, if you can't even protect your own life, how can you talk about protecting the interests of others? After hearing this, Kong Chuanxin finally made a decision. He wasn't an indecisive person to begin with. Otherwise, he wouldn't have become the battalion commander of Lung Feng. Alright, since that's the case, then let's rest for a while. When they are almost done fighting, we will make our move. Alright, prepare the weapons to break the city gate. We will see your performance later. With Kong Chuanxin's order, Tianzi changed from his seat to a standing position. He gave a standard military salute and said, "Rest assured, battalion commander. We will complete our mission." Crown Prince Li Yuanlong didn't know what the mercenaries were going to do next. He had already retreated from the East City Tower. After all, the catapults didn't have eyes. Who knew when they would land on his head? If he was hit, wouldn't he die with no one to seek justice? Other than Crown Prince Li Yuanlong, there was also the famous General Fan Yuhai and another general surnamed Li Xiaozhong. After they followed the Crown Prince back to the palace, they discussed what to do next. "Your Highness, don't worry. Today's battle was all Ruan Gengwang's fault. He underestimated the enemy and advanced prematurely, which led to his defeat. As long as we defend the city gate, the mercenaries won't be able to gain any advantage with our advantage in numbers." Li Xiaozhong was the first to step forward. He was comforting the Crown Prince, but he was also expressing his opinion on this battle. That's right. The other generals nodded in agreement, seemingly agreeing with Li Xiaozhong's words. Who was the Crown Prince? Ruan Gengwang was the Crown Prince of a country. If nothing unexpected happened, he would be the future king. Nothing must happen to him. Even if something happened, it would be because his subordinates didn't understand the Crown Prince's intentions and didn't do a good job. If the battle was lost, someone had to be the scapegoat. Ruan Gengwang, who died on the battlefield, became the scapegoat. Although the Crown Prince Li Yuanlong couldn't bear it, he had to make this decision for the sake of the overall situation. Alright, since everyone has the same opinion, then this matter is settled. However, in order to prevent any accidents from happening, we still need to mobilize the troops. General Fan, I'll have to trouble you with this matter. Li Yuanlong nodded helplessly and handed over the battle to the famous General Fan Yuhai. This general has received the order. Fan Yuhai cupped his fists and left the hall. There was no time to lose. For the sake of Hanoi's safety, some things couldn't be delayed and had to be done immediately. After Fan Yuhai left, Li Yuanlong discussed with the generals what to do next while waiting for news of the battle at the East Gate to end. At the East Gate, after the Crown Prince left, all battle matters were handed over to General Huang Hua. General Huang wasn't in a hurry when he saw the huge rocks blocking the city. He first sent people to evacuate some of the commoners near the eastern city gate while continuously ordering the archers to shoot down arrows from the top of the city gate tower. Compared to the cumbersome catapults, the archers were much more agile. In addition, they were on high ground, so they were unstoppable. In just an hour, they killed thousands of Jiaoji soldiers. They also threw down many rocks and wooden sleepers from below the city tower, destroying 10 catapults below. Without the catapults, the Jiaoji soldiers' attack power was completely weakened. They didn't even have many bows and arrows in their hands, so they became live targets with nowhere to hide. Seeing more and more of their brothers die, some of the Jiaoji soldiers turned around and ran toward the mercenaries. When they were 300 meters away, they threw down their weapons and knelt down to surrender. Everyone had the desire to live. Seeing that there was no way out, they could only turn around and beg for mercy. Although they were uneasy and didn't know how the mercenaries would deal with them, there was still some hope for them to try. It was much better than waiting outside the city as a target. Go to a camp of temporary auxiliary soldiers and confiscate their weapons. Tie them up with ropes. Camp Commander Kong Chuanxin waved his hand and 400 temporary auxiliary soldiers rushed forward. They surrounded the Jiaoji soldiers who had already surrendered and lost their will to fight. Speaking of which, there were at least 7,000 Jiaoji soldiers who were still alive. The ratio of 400 people surrounding 7,000 people didn't seem to be harmonious. However, on the battlefield, such things happened frequently. When facing a group of defeated soldiers, especially those who had lost their will to fight, one only needed to pay a small price to detain them. It was just like when the Japanese army invaded China. 2 Japanese soldiers could detain 2,000 Chinese for tens of li. Thinking about it now, it didn't seem very possible. However, it did happen. It had to be said that when a nation lost their will to fight, it was very sad. After dealing with the 7,000 captives, Chang Tiansu also started to get busy. First, he organized the troops. Then he called out the 10 soldiers from each platoon. Unlike the other soldiers of the Cold Front, these 10 soldiers, from the squad leader to the vice squad leader to the ordinary soldiers, each carried a large wooden box on their backs. Along the way, they had been switching to carry the boxes, and their speed was not much slower than the other comrades. When they were called out, each of them opened the wooden box skillfully. Then, 5 individual rocket launchers were assembled and placed in each of their hands. His gaze swept across the soldiers. When he saw that they were all filled with fighting spirit, Chang Tiansu nodded in satisfaction. He pointed at the east gate of Hanoi a few hundred meters away and said loudly, "Blast open that gate. Platoon 1 and 2 cover it. Platoon 3 and the auxiliary battalion will charge in when the gate is opened. Anyone who resists, kill without mercy." The order to attack the city was finally given by Chang Tiansu. A total of 500 mercenaries puffed out their chests and shouted in unison. They then turned around and began to move towards the east gate of Hanoi City in rows. On the east gate, General Huang Hua was commanding the soldiers to clean up the battlefield. Chapter 509. In the battle just now, there were still a few boulders that fell on top of the city tower, injuring some soldiers and destroying some city walls. If they weren't properly repaired, it would become a troublesome matter when facing an attack. While arranging for the city walls to be cleaned, Huang Hua ordered his men to fetch a large number of bows and arrows. They had wasted a lot of arrows from the previous battle and now was the time to replenish them. "General, look, they are moving. It seems like they are heading towards us." A soldier in charge of observing the mercenaries shouted loudly, attracting the attention of everyone, including Huang Hua. "They are really coming." Following that, a Jiaoji soldier shouted loudly. It could be heard that there was a hint of fear in this shout. Huang Hua was also awakened by the shout. When he saw that the mercenaries were indeed moving towards the east gate, his expression changed drastically. He had always thought that after the previous wave of attacks, the mercenaries would know the difficulty of attacking the city. At the very least, there would be a period of respite before the main force of the enemy arrived. However, he did not expect that they would dare to launch another attack with less than 3,000 men. Are they tired of living? Don't they know that with the city walls as cover, it is impossible for them to charge up with just 3,000 men? Many thoughts flashed through his mind in an instant. Although Huang Hua did not know what they would do, as a general, He instinctively ordered his soldiers to get into position and prepare to defend the city. He did not immediately send someone to inform the crown prince because he was still somewhat confident. With the sturdy city walls, they should be able to withstand the attacks of the mercenaries. Of course, he was more curious because he did not see any siege ladders in the enemy's hands. How were they going to attack the city? Just as this thought flashed through his mind, he suddenly thought of how Wang was defeated. When he thought about the advanced weapons that could explode when thrown out, he felt his scalp go numb. He shouted to the Jiaoji soldiers beside him, "Archers, get ready. Don't let them get close to the city gates. Don't let them blow up the city gates. Also, send someone to inform the crown prince that we need reinforcements. The more the better." Huang Hua's shouts caused the Jiaoji soldiers on the city walls to panic. Just when the mercenaries were 200 meters away from the city walls, the battlements were filled with archers. They knocked their arrows and prepared to shoot at the enemy at any moment. The archers were ready, but the mercenaries didn't do as they wished. They stopped when they were 130 meters away from the tower. In this position, the archers had no room to display their skills. Even if an arrow was shot, it wouldn't be able to reach that far. What are they doing? Seeing the mercenaries suddenly stop, all the Jiaoji soldiers on the tower widened their eyes. General Huang Hua, who was leading the team, had a bad premonition. However, he still couldn't figure out what the other party wanted to do. At a distance of 130 meters, Tiansu ordered the army to stop. Then, the 5 rocket launchers took another 5 steps forward. Then, 3 of them aimed at the city gate while 2 of them aimed at the city tower. It only took them a few seconds to do all this. From this point, it seemed like they had been training for a long time. They were fully prepared. The first squad leader was one of the 5 rocket launchers. Seeing that his comrades were ready, he first took a deep breath and stabilized his breathing. Then he began the countdown. The moment the word 1 rang out, 5 cannonballs with flames flew out horizontally, whistling through the air and flying straight towards their respective targets. Boom, 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 boom. 5 deafening sounds rang out one after another, shocking everyone's eyes. Not only were the rocket launchers shocking, but their effects were also very shocking. The 2 rockets that were aimed at the city tower exploded in the crowd of Jiaoji soldiers. One of them was even close to General Huang Hua. The moment the explosion sounded, the powerful impact threw General Huang Hua to the ground. The 2 Jiaoji soldiers who were standing at the spot where the explosion hit were blown into pieces. There wasn't a single intact part of their bodies. They were completely obliterated. After the 3 rocket launchers that were aimed at the East City Gate exploded, the impact was even greater. They directly blew up half of the city gate, creating a 3 to 4 meter wide opening. People could easily pass through. Fire! The Tiansu company commander who was already prepared was waiting for this scene. Seeing that the rocket launchers had completed their initial target, he shouted loudly. Then he led the troops with the Type 95 and fired at the Jiaoji archers on the city tower who were still in a daze. At a distance of 130 meters, the archers couldn't do anything to the mercenaries. However, regardless of whether it was the Type 95 or the Type 81 assault rifle, they didn't take this distance seriously. The bullets in their barrels could easily land on the city tower, dealing a heavy blow to the Jiaoji soldiers who weren't mentally prepared. Even though the bullets weren't mass-produced and lost some accuracy, at least 50% of the bullets still hit the enemy. Even if the bullets didn't hit their targets, once they hit the battlements, the impact was still frightening. It was enough to force the Jiaoji soldiers to retreat, not daring to expose themselves in the air without any cover. The 1st and 2nd platoons of Lung Feng soldiers used the Type 95 to suppress the archers on the city tower. The 3 platoons of Lung Feng and a battalion of auxiliary soldiers used this opportunity to charge towards the ruined East City Gate. First, a few grenades were tossed out nearby. Not only did they blow up the entrance of the city gate, but they also scared off the Jiaoji soldiers who wanted to reinforce the city gate. Then, the 400 mercenaries advanced triumphantly, taking advantage of this opportunity to kill their way into the city. After Tiansu's side achieved victory, Battalion Commander Kong Chuanxin led the main force and rushed over. They entered one after another, stabilizing their advantage. On the city tower, Huang Hua, who was knocked down by the rocket launchers, stood up under the protection of a few bodyguards. When he looked down at the city, he could feel the blood in his heart spurting out. It's over, it's over, it's all over. He sat on the ground with a thump. With the city gate lost, as the general of the city defense, he had an undeniable responsibility. General, the mercenaries are coming up the city ladder. Let's kill our way out. One of the bodyguards saw that the Jiaoji soldiers who wanted to escape didn't go far down the city ladder before a series of gunshots rang out. Then, they all ran back up the city tower. He guessed what had happened and suggested to Huang Hua. It's useless. We'll die if we kill our way out. Huang Hua shook his head dejectedly. He knew this crown prince too well. Ruan Gengwang was the scapegoat for the previous failure. Then, he would definitely be the scapegoat for the loss of the city gate. In this way, whether they killed their way out or not, they would still die. Seeing that the general had no intention of killing his way out, the bodyguard kindly reminded him, "General, why don't we surrender?" Just now, the soldiers outside the city surrendered. They all survived. Surrender? Huang Hua shook his head and said decisively, "Our Jiaoji generals will only die standing, not kneel down to live. Come on, take out my broadsword and fight it out with those mercenaries. If I kill one, I'll break even. If I kill two, I'll make a profit." Under Huang Hua's command, the Jiaoji soldiers on the city tower seemed to have found their backbone. Then, the 1,000 men began to charge down the city ladder in an organized manner. They shouted and yelled, creating quite a commotion. However, the city ladder wasn't wide to begin with. As long as two Type 95 pistols took turns to guard it and fire continuously, no one would be able to charge down the 20-meter-long spiral city ladder. After only 2 waves of attacks and over 50 people died, the other soldiers couldn't take it anymore. This was clearly the rhythm of charging down to die. There wasn't any hope of survival. Who would be willing to do it? No one was willing to charge down. This angered Huang Hua. He used his big sword to kill a Jiaoji soldier who didn't listen to his orders. Then he coldly looked at the other Jiaoji soldiers and said, "Since you've joined the army, fighting bloody battles on the battlefield is your destiny. Whoever dares to retreat, this person will be your example." Seeing the blood dripping down from the big sword, the Jiaoji soldiers became afraid. They had no choice but to charge again. Needless to say, under the muzzle of the Type 81 rifle, they left behind a bunch of corpses and retreated. At this moment, the shouts of the mercenaries could be heard from below the city tower. Those who surrender will be spared. Those who resist will be killed without mercy. Originally, there was no hope of survival. Everyone thought that since they were going to die anyway, they might as well charge out and die. However, now that there was a path of survival in front of them, everyone's thoughts became lively. However, at this moment, Huang Hua didn't care about all this. Seeing that another charge had failed, he still ordered the other Jiaoji soldiers to continue charging. He even said that even if they were to die, they should die on the way. It had to be said that Huang Hua was a brave general. However, it was a pity that sometimes a general's bravery wasn't enough to win a battle. Just like now, when everyone was in a dilemma, if you didn't want to encourage them and wanted to force them to die, who would listen to you? There were still a few centurions in the Jiaoji army. After they quickly exchanged glances, they brought their trusted aides and surrounded Huang Hua. "What are you guys doing?" Huang Hua's personal guards saw that the situation wasn't right. They shouted loudly, hoping to use their shouts to scare the enemy. If it was any other time, such shouts would definitely be effective. However, in the face of life and death, such shouts were clearly ineffective. The Jiaoji soldiers only hesitated for a moment before they began to surround them. Chapter 5:10. Since there were people who wanted them to die, in order to survive, they had no choice but to sacrifice themselves. Even though it seemed a little inappropriate to say these words, the truth was as such. The Jiaoji soldiers who wanted to live and surrender surrounded Huang Hua and his bodyguards. Then someone stabbed the first sword. After a series of clashing sounds, Huang Hua died in battle. His body was thrown to the city stairs and a white flag was hung high. The fall of Jiaoji's eastern city gate tower was completely out of Crown Prince Li Yuanlong's expectations. When he heard the news in the palace, it was as if he had been struck by lightning. He stood there motionless for a long time. Crown Prince, are you all right, Your Highness? Several young civil and military officials walked up to Li Yuanlong with anxious and concerned expressions on their faces. There were also some older ministers who shook their heads and quickly ran towards the depths of the palace. Crown Prince Li Yuanlong, who was shaken, finally recovered after a few breaths. The first thing he said was, fight back. We must take back the East Gate Tower and chase those mercenaries out of Hanoi City. Crown Prince, don't worry. Someone is already doing that. Not only that, we are also preparing to send the 10 iron carriages that we just built. General Li Xiaozhong comforted him. He was also preparing to go to the front lines to see if they could take back the East Gate. Good. Hearing Li Xiaozhong's arrangement, Li Yuanlong's expression became much better. His nervous mood seemed to have been relieved. Just as he was thinking about what to do next, footsteps suddenly came from the depths of the palace behind him. Then, a male duck's voice sounded, "The king has arrived." "Greetings, Your Majesty." All the officials, including Crown Prince Li Yuanlong, immediately knelt on the ground. What answered them was a cold and unhappy voice. Then, King Lili was helped to sit on the golden chair in the palace hall. Lili was indeed very old. In history, he should have been dead by now. But because of Yang Chendong's arrival, he was still alive. Apart from looking a little older, he was still in good spirits. At least, his face was glowing, much better than those officials who had been affected by the chaos and whose faces had turned pale. Sitting on the golden throne, Li Li's gaze was like a tiger king inspecting his territory. First, he looked around. Many officials and generals who were stared at by him couldn't help but lower their heads. Seemingly satisfied with the result, Li Li looked at Li Yuanlong again and shook his head. "Crown Prince, why do you only want to fight them head-on? Could it be that you think that the other party would retreat after killing their way through the city gates? You've really disappointed Father. This child is slow-witted. Father, please enlighten me." Li Yuanlong really didn't know what to say. The situation was messed up by him, and he indeed had an unavoidable responsibility. This was a heavy blow to his prestige as the Crown Prince. In the past, because Li Yuanlong was calm and generous, he had united many important officials and generals. Sometimes, King Lili had to worry about his feelings when giving orders. There were even some who said in private that the king was getting old and should consider abdicating the throne. The Jiaoji kingdom only had a young king to lead it to glory. These voices were the loudest in Jiuzhen Prefecture, where the Crown Prince was. After all, the Crown Prince was there. Some local officials thought that the king was far away, and very few people cared about the old King Lili. If this continued, it would not be good for the Jiaoji kingdom. It was even possible that there would be an all-out war. King Lili had his own information network, so he naturally knew a lot about this. He didn't want to give up the throne while he was still alive, nor did he want to see father and son turn against each other. In order to divert everyone's attention, the King of Min's envoy arrived, and he agreed to send troops to the South Ming Kingdom. However, he didn't think that the King of Min would be so snobbish and throw them aside as soon as he gained power. As for the Southern Ming Empire, all he wanted was a marriage alliance with a princess to express his goodwill. At the same time, he wanted to strengthen his authority in the Jiaoji Empire. To think that the mercenaries would come all the way here and create such a chaotic situation. If the Crown Prince could do it, it would be because the king had a good eye for talent. If it didn't work, it would be because he had suppressed the Crown Prince's arrogance. Thus, Lili had been watching coldly from the sidelines and didn't have any intention of making a move. Now that a hole had been opened in the capital, it was time for him to take charge of the situation and turn the tide. As soon as he appeared, he first reprimanded Li Yuanlong, strongly suppressing the Crown Prince's arrogance. When this hand was shown, those who originally wanted to flatter the Crown Prince's smelly feet had to think deeply. The old king was still alive. Should they restrain themselves? Just as some officials were considering their stance, King Lili's voice sounded again. However, there was a sense of desolation in his voice. Since they have already entered the city, we should leave. Pass down the order. The East Gate will continue to resist, but it doesn't need to be too intense. We just need to delay their advance. As for the others, withdraw from Hanei City and head to Shiyu City. General Fan Yuhai is already waiting for us there with a large group of warriors. What? As soon as the voice fell, everyone looked up with a puzzled expression. Although it was true that the mercenaries had taken down the East Gate, for the Jiaoji Kingdom's capital, Hanei City, they still had the power to resist. In many people's eyes, if they were willing to pay a large price, it was not impossible to counterattack and take back the city gate. But why did they have to withdraw? What they didn't expect was that the king seemed to have known that things would develop like this and actually arranged a large number of soldiers in Shiyu City. They were still wondering why they couldn't see Fan Yuhai just now. It turned out that he had another important task. Many people couldn't figure it out and their eyes fell on the Crown Prince Li Yuanlong, who was also kneeling on the ground. Obviously, they wanted the Crown Prince to stand up and question the king. Being looked at by so many expectant eyes, Li Yuanlong really wanted to stand up and say something. While he was thinking about what to say, King Li on the Golden Throne spoke first. That's right, I just received news that most of the Jiuzhen County has been captured by the mercenaries. I'm afraid that the southern Sun County will be in danger. Plop. This was the sound of the Crown Prince wanting to stand up, but before he could do so, he fell to the ground. The Jiuzhen County is the Crown Prince's headquarters and foundation. In the past few years, he had properly arranged all the officials there. It can be said that his orders there were far more effective than his father's. This was also what Li Yuanlong relied on. He just wanted to say that he would arrange for the Jiuzhen County to send troops to save Hanei City. But now the East Gate has been captured. This result was like a bolt from the blue that hit him so hard that he fell to the ground. At this moment, the only essence in his body seemed to have been sucked dry. The Crown Prince's performance fell into the eyes of some people. They quickly made a choice, and that was to continue supporting King Li. Look, the older the ginger, the spicier it is. With just a few words, the Crown Prince's reputation fell to the lowest point. It seems that he won't be able to recover in a few years. Even the Crown Prince didn't oppose it, so how could the other officials dare to question it? Besides, since the Jiuzhen County has been captured, it means that the mercenaries are serious. If this is the case, then Hanei City really can't be protected. It's better to take a step back and retreat to Shiyu City. Some people even think that even if they retreat to Shiyu City, it might not be the end. Fortunately, the king also said that General Fan Yuhai, who was supposed to deploy troops under the Crown Prince's orders, had already gone to Shiyu City. Moreover, he had already gathered a lot of troops there under the king's orders. This made some people feel more at ease. With the appearance of the king, the officials who didn't know what to do quickly went to make arrangements. After all, their family business was in Hanei City. Now that they suddenly wanted to leave, it would be very troublesome to pack up. It would take at least 3 to 5 days. King Li seemed to have noticed this problem. He waved his hand and said, "Remember, you only have 2 days. From now on, some things will be transported to Shiyu City. After 2 days, if anyone is still in the city, they will have to face the ferocious mercenaries alone." 2 days in the hands of the Great Ming's Baiming and Southern Ming officials, there was definitely not enough time. Over the years, they had bought too many things, so naturally, there were many things that needed to be taken care of. However, Jiaoji was only a small country. Whether it was the economy or agriculture, it wasn't very developed. Even if the officials wanted to fish, there was a limit to what they could get. If they used the 2 days, they would be able to take care of most of it. King Li gave the order to retreat. At the East Gate, Battalion Commander Kong Chuanxin was completely unaware of this. He was currently organizing people to guard the gate tower. Before the battle, Kong Chuanxin had discussed with his subordinates. It wasn't a big problem to take down Hanei City's East Gate by surprise. The key was whether or not they could defend it. After all, there were tens of thousands of Jiaoji soldiers in the city. Moreover, as long as they were organized properly, the Jiaoji citizens in the city could quickly form an army. If they really attacked like a wave, they would eventually run out of bullets. It was hard to say whether or not the 3,000 mercenaries would be able to defend the East Gate. Chapter 511. In fact, the number of mercenaries was far less than 3,000. After leaving a temporary auxiliary battalion and a cold vanguard company outside the city to take care of the 7,000 Jiaoji soldiers, the number of mercenaries at the East Gate Tower was only about 2,300. They were not fighting on their home ground, and they were at a disadvantage in terms of numbers. Kong Chuanxin did not have the confidence to win. Logically speaking, he should have sent someone to report to Yang Chendong and request for the main force to arrive quickly. That way, he would be able to put down the heavy burden on his shoulders. However, he did not do so. At least, from his point of view, the situation had not reached that critical point yet. Kong Chuanxin, who was already prepared, had even prepared a lot of bows and arrows so that he could save some bullets at the critical moment to prepare for a counterattack. However, what he saw was completely different from what he expected. The Jiaoji soldiers had no intention of charging forward. They were only a few hundred meters away from the East Gate Tower, staring at him. It was as if they would not move if he did not move. What are they doing? Kong Chuanxin felt that he could not see through the current situation. He ordered his scouts to look around to see if the other party had any tricks up their sleeves. At the same time, he sent someone to contact the agents of the Security Bureau in Hanoi City. He needed more information about the city. The scouts were sent out. They used telescopes to look around. However, the results were confusing. Not only did they not see any signs of Jiaoji soldiers moving around, they also saw many carriages coming out of the West Gate. Soon, the agents of the Security Bureau contacted them. The agents brought more accurate information. The Jiaoji soldiers had started to retreat. It seemed like they had no intention of fighting in Hanoi City. What are they doing? Even though Kong Chuanxin's mind was very open, he still could not understand the situation after receiving this report. Battalion Commander, let's report this to the 6th Young Master. Company Commander Tyance also could not understand the reason behind this. However, he knew that there was one person who could figure it out. That person was Yang Chendong. Okay. Kong Chuanxin nodded. After all, the development of the situation was somewhat beyond his expectations. Since there was such a big change, of course, he had to report this matter to the 6th Young Master. Next, whether to fight or stop, all they had to do was listen to orders. Just like that, the scouts rode out from the East Gate and headed straight for the main force of the mercenaries that were rushing over from the north. Under the leadership of Yang Chendong, the main force of the mercenaries advanced slowly while practicing their marksmanship. On one hand, he wanted to see if Kong Chuanxin's 3rd Battalion had the ability to fight alone and take down Hanoi City. On the other hand, this batch of bullets was requested in a hurry, so there was a slight discrepancy in the specifications, which directly reduced the accuracy. He wanted to request the Crimson City Munitions Factory to ensure both efficiency and quality. After that, he could only increase the number of target practice sessions to make up for the hit rate. Fortunately, after nearly 3 days of training, after each soldier had fired at least 100 bullets, the rate of hitting the target had significantly increased. Only then could he relax a little. It was also at this time that the scouts sent by Kong Chuanxin arrived. In reality, they were only 40 miles away from Hanoi City. The sudden arrival of the scouts inevitably caused Yang Chendong to have many guesses. He believed that the scouts were most likely here to ask for help, so he immediately met with the scouts and learned about what happened in Hanoi City. The Jiaoji soldiers are retreating out of the city. Is this news accurate? After listening to the scouts' report, Yang Chendong also showed a puzzled expression. It was just that he hid it very well and no one else noticed. Replying to the 6th Young Master's question, this matter has been confirmed by the scouts of the 3rd Battalion and the agents of the Security Bureau stationed in Hanoi City. Moreover, our commander also said that after taking over the east side of the city, other than the first wave of fierce counterattacks from the Jiaoji army, there were no more big battles to fight. The scout was smart enough not to give a yes or no answer. He only reported what he knew. Okay, I understand. You can go and rest for a while. Yang Chendong nodded. With the above evidence, the Jiaoji army was really going to retreat. He couldn't help but sigh. As the commander of the Jiaoji army, this kind of courage was truly admirable. Yang Chendong had already made preparations to fight with the main forces of the Jiaoji army in Hanoi City. At that time, with the powerful weapons in his hands, he could guarantee that the Jiaoji army would be completely defeated. If that happened, the outcome of the battle in Jiaoji would be decided. However, from the looks of it, things weren't that simple. Although he still didn't understand why the Jiaoji army would give up on their capital, if he didn't take advantage of such a good opportunity, it would be a waste. Tiger's man immediately passed down the order. The army is to move out at full speed and rush to Hanoi City. Since there was a good opportunity to chase after the enemy, Yang Chendong naturally wouldn't let it go. He immediately made the decision. After the order was given, the mercenary army, which had been moving slowly, suddenly moved forward at a rapid pace. The army of close to 60,000 men was like a long snake, heading straight for Hanoi City, the capital of Jiaoji. It was only a distance of 40 li, and in less than 8 hours, the 60,000 men had all arrived. Outside the city, 3rd Battalion Commander Kong Chuanxin was leading a group of officers to welcome Yang Chendong's arrival. When they saw Yang Chendong approaching on horseback, Kong Chuanxin and the rest maintained their upright posture and gave a standard military salute. Yang Chendong dismounted from his horse, returned the salute, and shook hands with Kong Chuanxin and the rest. Then, he said with an extremely confident tone, "All of you have worked hard. After this, I will definitely reward you based on your contributions. Now, let's talk about the situation in the city." When he heard that they would be rewarded based on their contributions, Kong Chuanxin's mouth widened into a smile. "Thank you for your affirmation, 6th young master. The situation in the city is already very clear. The Jiaoji army is indeed retreating. The information from the agents of the Security Bureau is that the Crown Prince, Li Yuanlong, is no longer in charge of the Jiaoji nation. Instead, the old king, Li, is in charge. Retreating from Jiaoji to Shiyu City was also the old king's decision." Li's decision? Yang Chendong nodded his head. If that was the case, then everything made sense. Who was Li? He was someone who dared to go against the great Ming dynasty at its peak. Not only were his methods sharp and vicious, but he also had an extraordinary view of the big picture. This kind of person would often make some risky decisions. However, behind such military actions, there were often unspeakable secrets. Along the way, Yang Chendong finally understood the purpose of the Jiaoji army's actions. He had to admit that this was indeed a brilliant move to take the initiative. Unfortunately, this move was still too weak to deal with the mercenaries and himself. Kong Chuanxin still didn't understand the purpose of Li's actions. When he saw that Yang Chendong was deep in thought, he couldn't help but ask anxiously, "6th young master, why do you think the Jiaoji army is doing this?" "Of course it's because they don't want to be led by the nose. They want to jump outside and attack us." Yang Chendong chuckled with a confident expression. "Jump outside and attack us?" Kong Chuanxin still didn't understand. It wasn't just him. Even the 2nd Regiment commander, Luo Pe, and 2nd Battalion commander, Chen Bo, who were following behind Yang Chendong, were also confused. "Bring me the map." Yang Chendong knew that if he didn't explain the situation clearly to his subordinates, they wouldn't be confident when the battle started. He waved his hand and asked Tiger's Mane to bring over the hand-drawn map of Jiaoji. A few of the officers grabbed a corner of the map and spread it open. Then, Yang Chendong pointed at the Jiaoji capital, Hanoi City, and said, "We are here now. Shiyu City is slightly northwest of Hanoi, less than 200 li away. Compared to Hanoi City, which is the capital, Shiyu City is where we have to pass to head to the west and north. If we don't deal with this, we won't be able to head in either direction with ease. Otherwise, we will face the danger of having our supplies and provisions cut off." After hearing this, Luo Pe and the rest nodded their heads. Obviously, they agreed with Yang Chendong's judgment and analysis. Yang Chendong then pointed at the map and said, "Hanoi City is the capital of Jiaoji, but at the same time, the environment here is very complicated. It's not like Chu-I City and Beidai City. There are many cities and roads that lead to Hanoi City. In other words, if we occupy this place, we will be attacked from all directions at any time. Although I don't know what that old man Li Li is thinking, I'm sure he will try to encircle us. With our limited manpower, we need to defend against enemies from all directions. On top of that, we have to deal with the mess in Hanoi City. It's not going to be easy. As he gestured for Tiger's Mane to keep the map, Yang Chendong looked at Luo Per and the rest and asked, "How about it? If you have any thoughts or opinions, feel free to voice them out." Facing Yang Chendong's encouraging gaze, Luo Per only hesitated for a moment before voicing his worries. Reporting to 6th Young Master, the encirclement won't be a threat to us for the time being. We will talk about it after the enemy has settled down. However, the internal strife in Hanoi City must be resolved. In order to solve the problem of chaos, we must first solve the problem of food. Food has become the most important thing. Chapter 5:12. Not bad. Yang Chendong was very happy to see Luo Per hit the nail on the head. He really hoped that his officers could grow quickly and become independent. Otherwise, conquering the world was a huge undertaking, and it was impossible to rely on a few limited people. Commander Luo is right. Since that is the case, what are we waiting for? 6th Young Master, the 2nd Battalion requests for battle. Battalion Commander Chin Bo, who was eager to give it a try, was the first to speak when he saw the opportunity. The 3rd Battalion Commander, Kong Chuanxin, was still contemplating the pros and cons of this plan when Chin Bo suddenly spoke up to snatch the right to lead the attack. He immediately said in dissatisfaction, "Battalion Commander Chin, Hanoi City was conquered by our 3rd Battalion first. The task of entering the city and snatching the rations should naturally be done by our 3rd Battalion, isn't that right, Regiment Commander?" Seeing that both of his battalion commanders were requesting to join the battle, Luo Per smiled at Political Commissar Kong Jia. Then he looked at Yang Chendong without blinking. As a commander, he couldn't favor one and discriminate against the other. Of course, it was best to let the 6th Young Master handle this. Yang Chendong knew that the food was important now, and it wasn't the time to argue. He immediately said, "All right, 3rd Battalion has taken down Hanoi's East City Tower. They are very tired. The task of stealing food will be handed over to 2nd Battalion. But I'll say the ugly words first. If you can't control the granary, then you should obediently withdraw and let 3rd Battalion take over. Oh right, when we attack later, we can let Hong Jin's Jiaoji mercenaries take the lead." Next would be a city battle, also known as a street battle. It was naturally much more dangerous than fighting in the open field. Of course, such a dangerous task would be left to Hong Jin's Jiaoji mercenaries. 6th Young Master, please don't worry. 2nd Battalion will complete the task. Chin Bo saluted and went to prepare. After gathering the 2 battalions and the 2 auxiliary battalions, as well as the 4 temporary auxiliary battalions, the battalion commanders of the Cold Front Battalion could mobilize far more soldiers than a regiment. He also arranged for someone to call Hong Jin over. At this time, Hong Jin was happily busy. Ever since Yang Chendong had given him permission to build a 30,000-strong army, he had put all his energy into this matter. When they had just set off from Beatty City, they had already gathered a team of 2,000 people. Originally, he thought that it would take a lot of time for the team to grow. Unexpectedly, an opportunity presented itself when they arrived at Hanoi City. In front of him were the 6,000 Jiaoji soldiers who had been captured. Originally, there were 7,000 men, but after Kong Chuanxin's 3rd Battalion took away 1,000 strong men, there were only 6,000 left. Hong Jin was overjoyed at the sudden appearance of 6,000 soldiers. He immediately sent people to work on these people. There was no lack of methods to scare them. If they did not join the ranks of the Jiaoji mercenaries, they would be sent to reform through labor and work as laborers for the rest of their lives. Being able to eat rations as a soldier was naturally better than being a coolie. Soon, his army expanded from 2,000 to 8,000. Hong Jin had also become a powerful general. Even so, Hong Jin did not have any pride in his heart. He knew that compared to a real mercenary army, he was still an outsider. Especially in front of the most elite Lung Feng, he and his 8,000 men were nothing more than a motley crew. If they really fought, they had no chance of winning. With such feelings, he was called to the 2nd Battalion Commander Qin Bo. General Hong, the opportunity to make a contribution has come. The 6th young master said that you and I should work together to kill our way into Hanoi City and take control of the places where the rations are stored. All right, you should be very familiar with the geography of the city. Hearing that there was a battle to fight, Hong Jin became very excited. Although he knew that using him now was mostly to be used as a shield, and that there would be a lot of casualties, it was better to be useful than useless. At that moment, he imitated the mercenaries and stood at attention. He saluted and said, "Don't worry, Battalion Commander Chen. I am very familiar with the situation in Hanoi City. I also know where the rations are stored. I even know where the rations are stored. You only need to bring your men and follow behind me." Chen Bo was very happy that Hong Jin was so considerate. "Very good. Then I will rely on you, General Hong. When this is done, I will definitely ask the 6th young master to reward you." "Thank you for your guidance, Battalion Commander Chen." Hong Jin was waiting for this sentence. After saying this, he chuckled. With Hong Jin's guarantee and lead, the 8,000 Jiaoji mercenaries tied a white towel on their right arm. After that, the army quickly entered Hanoi City from the East City Gate. Behind them were 7 battalions, with the 2nd Battalion of Lung Feng as the main force. There were close to 3,000 soldiers in total. A total of 11,000 people suddenly appeared and launched a fierce attack on Hanoi City. The originally balanced situation instantly went out of control. It was true that the mercenaries had taken down the East City Gate Tower, but due to the lack of manpower, they were still in a defensive state. This caused the Jiaoji soldiers to slowly let down their guard. In their eyes, it was already a good thing that they did not initiate an attack. Why would the enemy dare to take the initiative to find trouble with them? With such an arrogant attitude, the sudden appearance of more than 10,000 mercenaries caught the Jiaoji army in the city off guard. After that, the two sides engaged in a chaotic battle for more than 2 hours. In the end, when Qin Bo led the real mercenaries to appear, the battle became one-sided. The Jiaoji soldiers were defeated. In just the beginning of the battle, the Jiaoji mercenaries lost 2,000 men and injured 1,000. The Jiaoji soldiers suffered even more losses. The corpses and blood on the ground proved everything. You did well. There are always casualties in war. However, these deaths are valuable. Chen Bo was afraid that Hong Jin would be heartbroken over the loss. He walked over and patted Hong Jin's shoulder, encouraging him. "I am fine. Don't worry, Battalion Commander Chen. Next, we can charge to the 3rd Street in the west. There is a granary in the city there." Hong Jin shook his head and chuckled. Speaking of which, Qin Bo was overly worried. Just as he had said, how could there be no deaths in a war? Often, in a big war, even if the winning side lost thousands or tens of thousands of people, it was an extremely normal thing. Only the mercenaries would suffer a huge loss if they lost a few hundred men. Therefore, Hong Jin did not care about such a small loss. Moreover, these people had just joined him. They did not have any feelings for each other. If they died, they died. In any case, he could continue to recruit soldiers in the future. As long as he gained Yang Chendong's trust, he would not have to worry about the source of soldiers. Hong Jin did not have to worry about this. He became the king of Lili. Originally, the 2 days he gave the officials was a little rushed. This caused chaos in some places. However, who would have thought that the mercenaries would take the initiative to attack? This made his so-called 2 days even more tense. He even felt that it was not enough. "Pass down my orders. Immediately send 20,000 men to suppress the mercenaries. We must suppress the mercenaries' attack." Li Li shouted to the generals in the palace. When he turned around and left the palace, he ordered the people in the palace to quickly leave the city with him. Take what you can take, and don't take what you can't take. Just hide them. He firmly believed that there would be a day when he would return. 20,000 men were sent out. However, they had lost their fighting spirit. How could they be a match for the mercenaries who were desperately looking for people to fight? After a few small-scale chaos, thousands of corpses were left behind. The Jiaoji army in the city fought as they retreated. Most of them gathered around the west city gate. If they really wanted to cut off the Jiaoji army's retreat, it would be a bloody and bitter battle. For the sake of their only retreat, the Jiaoji army would not give up easily. In the end, both sides would suffer great losses. However, Chen Bo's goal was not to cut off the Jiaoji army's retreat. They wanted more food. Since everyone's goals were different, there were fewer conflicts. In the end, after 2 days, the Jiaoji royal family, the officials, and the nobles all left Haniai. Chen Bo and the others also managed to snatch 2 granaries of food as they wished, as well as the food stored by some of the larger families. The logistics department had already done the calculations. This amount of food was enough to feed an army of 300,000 for a year. With food, Yang Chendong's heart could be at ease. While praising Chen Bo for completing his mission, he also called Hong Jin over and allowed him to expand the Jiaoji mercenaries in the city. Of course, the military strength was still 30,000. Most of the nobles in Jiaoji had fled, but most of the commoners did not. Their ancestral property was here. If they really fled, they did not know where they could go or what they could do. As such, they were like criminals waiting to be judged, waiting in their own homes. At this moment, the 47,000 Jiaoji youths were put to use. Back when they were in Crimson City, they had already undergone systematic learning. While not all of them were elementary scholars, they were still able to read and communicate with others. After arriving at Beidai City, they were met by Yang Chendong a few times and had a few lectures. As such, they knew what to do next. Now that it was time to send them to work, under the protection of the Jiaoji mercenaries, the auxiliary mercenaries, and temporary auxiliary soldiers, they began to roam the streets. The tasks that these youths had to do were simple and even crude. They would explain the policies of the mercenaries to the commoners. They would tell them that as long as they lived like before, farming and doing business, no one would make things difficult for them. The mercenaries would even sell some of the food to them to ensure that they had enough to eat. Chapter 5:13. The policy was announced. Those who cooperated would naturally receive the basic respect of the mercenaries. However, those who did not cooperate would be in trouble. The educated youth would stand on the street and wave his hand, and the mercenaries or Jiaoji mercenaries would rush over to capture them. Then, they would casually label them or send them to reform through labor. Those who committed serious crimes would be killed on the street. Yang Chendong would not tolerate the foreign races as much as he did the Han people. Yang Chendong would even tolerate the ethnic minorities living in the Han area, such as the Miao people. However, he would not be courteous to the Jiaoji people, a fickle and petty country. It was either to admit defeat or to arrest him. There was no third option. Under the high-pressure policy, the law and order in Hanoi City returned to normal in just 5 days. When Yang Chendong walked on the streets, he saw the normal life of the citizens. The only difference was that the smell of blood on the streets had not dissipated. Moreover, he could often see the mercenaries patrolling the streets. Looking at the statistics sent by the Tiger's Man, more than 5,000 people had been killed in Hanoi City in 5 days, and more than 40,000 had been captured. Hanoi City, which originally had 300,000 citizens, was now left with only 250,000 people. It was a loss of 1/6 of its original population. Of course, the 5,000 people killed were not only the Jiaoji people who resisted. There were also some Jiaoji people who wanted to fish in troubled waters, and some Jiaoji mercenaries who wanted to take advantage of the situation to commit all kinds of crimes. Hong Jin had already been reprimanded by Yang Chendong for this matter. Regardless, the situation had temporarily stabilized, and the atmosphere in the city had changed. The next step was to send these people to Chu-Yi City in batches, and then send them to Ryukyu Island by sea. That place was lacking in population. This time, when the 50,000 educated youth were transferred from there, Yu Qian, who was in charge of the overall situation there, was very unhappy. In the end, Yang Chendong said that there would be more than 100,000 people. Only then did he reluctantly agree. Yu Qian was such a person. He had a righteous heart, and he was not afraid of anyone. Even if it was Yang Chendong's order, he would still dare to refute it. Since they had agreed to send back 100,000 people, the 40,000 people they had captured earlier would become the first batch. There was still a gap of 60,000 people, and they would have to choose from the civilians of Hanoi City. Of course, such trivial matters would be handled by others. Yang Chendong only needed to arrange the orders. In 5 days, the situation in Hanoi City was stabilized. Especially with sufficient food, the atmosphere in the city was normal. However, it was a completely different story outside the city. Previously, when Lili had retreated from Hanoi City, Yang Chendong had already guessed that the other party was preparing to besiege Hanoi City. However, he didn't know what the other party would do. However, 5 days later, he finally received news that Lili had not only gathered 200,000 troops near Shiyu City, but he had also allied with the Lan Tsang Kingdom, Laos in the future, sending 100,000 troops from Yingluan to Hanoi. With 300,000 troops outside, this was the feast that Lili had prepared for Yang Chendong. This Lili is really getting old. Does he think that this young master will play some kind of battle with him? He wants to surround me with these few people, Yang Chendong sneered as he looked at the report in Tiger's Mane's hand and threw it aside. Then, he said thoughtfully, the Lan Tsang Kingdom has also intervened. That's good. Originally, I thought that just dealing with Jiaoji wouldn't be much of a challenge. Since they want to interfere, then I'll just deal with them as well. At this moment, Yang Chendong was showing great confidence, without a trace of nervousness or panic. Seeing him like this, Tiger's Mane and Beta Persei were also full of confidence. In their eyes, there was nothing in the world that could stop the young master and the young master. 5 days was enough for the news of Hanoi City to spread. In the southern Ming capital's Nanjing residence, Zhu Qizhen, who was in the imperial palace, received this news. In that instant, he was so shocked that he almost fell off his throne. Be careful, Your Majesty. Eunuch Chao Jixiang, who had been observing from the side, was also given a fright and hurriedly reached out to support him. Zhu Qizhen, who had been supported by his arm, was covered in cold sweat. He didn't seem to care about Chao Jixiang at all. Instead, he seemed to be asking a question, as if he was talking to himself. Great companion, is this true? Yang Chendong only has 10,000 soldiers, and he can take down the Jiaoji kingdom's capital? There should be hundreds of thousands of Jiaoji soldiers there. Chao Jixiang didn't know how to answer this question, and this result was also out of his expectations. Like many others, he thought that Yang Chendong was overestimating himself by declaring war on Jiaoji. Even if he had the most advanced firearms in his possession, the lack of manpower was still a major drawback. Moreover, the environment, terrain, and climate there were all different from the Great Ming Dynasty. It would take a long time for them to adapt to the environment there. It was just like when the Great Ming had sent troops to Jiaoji. They had been quite aggressive, but because many of them couldn't adapt to the environment, they had lost a lot of soldiers, and they couldn't do much. With this as an example, the mercenaries wouldn't fare much better. Who knew that the mercenaries would be so ferocious and be able to kill their way into the Great Ming's capital in such a short period of time and even succeed? Even King Li, who was not to be trifled with, had no choice but to retreat. Moreover, according to the reports, this old king had been forced to ally with the Lan Tsang Kingdom to defend against the Great Ming's forces. Only then had he been able to stand firm. The changes and developments of the situation had indeed exceeded everyone's expectations. This was why Zhu Qizhen was so shocked, but this was within reason. It took a while for Zhu Qizhen's expression to return to normal, but the fear in his heart did not lessen. Since Yang Chendong could force Jiaoji to suffer defeat after defeat, what would happen if he fought with the southern Ming army? He didn't dare to think about it. Zhu Qizhen felt some regret. If he had known this would happen, he wouldn't have given Yang Chendong a chance to attack Jiaoji. At that time, he had wanted to weaken the Great Ming's strength, but now, it seemed that he was strengthening the Great Ming's strength. After all, if an army wanted to develop, it was like a flower seedling wanting to grow. First, it had to find a suitable soil. Whether it was in the southern Ming or Beiming, there was no such soil for mercenaries to grow. With so many restrictions, it was easy to imagine how difficult it would be for an army to develop. However, once they went out, it would be different. The reports had clearly stated that the captured Chu-Yi and Beatty cities of Jiaoji were being managed by mercenaries. This meant that they had a certain foundation. If they were allowed to develop, the consequences would be unimaginable. After all, just 10,000 mercenaries were able to force the Jiaoji army to retreat. Once this army's numbers continued to increase, what would happen? Wouldn't that mean that one day, the great Ming Empire wouldn't be a match for them and would be in great danger? When he thought about how this danger was caused by him, it would be strange if Zhu Qizhen's expression was good. This won't do. We can't let them develop any further. Pass down my decree. Have Lu Deshang immediately come to an agreement with Jiaoji. At the same time, send a decree to Duke Zhongdan. Tell him that Jiaoji has been on good terms with the southern Ming Empire for generations. Now, they have submitted to me and agreed to establish a new Jiaoji province. This was Zhu Qizhen oppressing Yang Chendong with the general trend, making his painstaking efforts go down the drain. After saying all this, Zhu Qizhen asked Chao Jixiang, "Have the people sent to Jianing left?" Chao Jixiang knew that Zhu Qizhen was concerned about Yang Chendong's fourth brother, Yang Yang. He immediately nodded and replied, "Reporting to your majesty, they have already set off. They should have arrived in Jianing by now." Zhu Qizhen didn't say anything immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes and thought for a moment. When Zhu Qizhen opened his eyes, a new idea had appeared. "Great friend, immediately send a trusted aide to Jianing. Inform them that they must treat Duke Zhongdan's fourth brother well. At the same time, they must invite him to Nanjing. I want to give him a high position. Temporarily, he will be the Minister Counselor of the Ministry of Works." The Minister Counselor of the Ministry of Works was a secondary class, rank 5 official position. In comparison, the position in the Ministry of Works wasn't an important position and didn't have much power. It was more symbolic. Previously, he sent people to Jianing to capture Yang Chendong. Although he didn't say what crime he would commit, capturing Yang Chendong first was a form of intimidation. However, now that he suddenly gave Yang Chendong an official position, Chao Jixiang couldn't help but have another thought. Was the emperor a little too timid? Otherwise, why would he suddenly change his mind and give Yang Chendong an official position? Of course, this could also be seen as a way of showing goodwill or conciliation. However, this was only possible after the fall of the Jiaoji nation. It seemed that the real reason was already on the verge of being revealed. However, no matter what thoughts he had, since this was the emperor's decree, Chao Jixiang had to obey. He immediately nodded and replied, "Yes, Your Majesty." Then, he turned around and went to do his work. After the decree was passed down, Luda, who was originally arguing with the Jiaoji envoy and wanted more benefits, immediately changed his attitude. He expressed that he could ignore King Li Li's impudence and disrespect, referring to old Li Li wanting to marry the third princess of the Ming dynasty. As long as they really submitted to the great Ming dynasty, paid tribute every year, called themselves Jiaoji province, and sent troops to suppress the rebellion behind King Min and King Shiping, then the southern Ming dynasty could order Duke Zhongdan to withdraw his troops. Chapter 5:14. The Jiaoji envoy had also received the news that the capital had fallen, and his heart was already in chaos. Now that Luda was willing to take a step back, how could he not be grateful? He immediately expressed that Jiaoji was willing to submit, and he only hoped that the great Ming Duke would quickly withdraw his troops. After all, if this continued, Jiaoji would not be far from being destroyed. At that time, even if they withdrew their troops, it would not be King Li Li anymore. What was the difference between retreating and not retreating? Since the man had feelings for the woman, the agreement was quickly reached. Following this, the Jiaoji envoy and the great Ming envoy left Nanjing together, heading straight for Jiaoji. This was imperial power. In order to achieve their own selfish goals, they did not care about what the mercenaries had done, even if they were expanding the territory for the Han. 3 days later, the news that Yang Chendong had led the mercenaries to attack Jiaoji finally reached Bai Ming's capital. Similarly, substitute sect master Zhu Qiu was shocked to the core. During this period of time, Bai Ming had been peaceful and united, and they had been looking for a way to develop. The southern Ming dynasty was in chaos, and their minds were filled with lawsuits. They did not care about Bai Ming at all, and the Wala in the north was vigorously developing their businesses, so they had no intention of finding trouble with Bai Ming. With the outside world stable, Bai Ming had time to rest. Zhu Qiu could be considered a wise ruler. With the outside world stable, he recruited and trained his troops, and the morale and numbers of his troops had been greatly improved. This was especially so after receiving the Type 81 automatic assault rifle from the mercenaries. He had spent a lot of effort researching it, and the production of firearms and cannons had been continuously pushed forward. Although there was still a long way to go before they could produce a finished product, they were indeed starting to see the light of day. For example, they had already produced some ordinary cannons, and they had also begun to see the light of day in the structure of the Type 81 automatic assault rifle. It could be said that as long as they were given 1 or 2 more years, they might really be able to produce a Type 81 automatic assault rifle. This was the wisdom of the Han. As long as they were willing to put in the effort, there was nothing that could not be done. Just like in the future, it only took China a few decades to catch up with the most developed countries in the world economically. Although there was still a certain gap, it was obvious that the gap was getting smaller and smaller. All aspects of the work were on the right track, and Zhu Qiu's throne was becoming more and more stable. At this moment, his thoughts were a little wild. He wondered if there was a chance to unify the northern and southern Ming dynasty and recreate the glory of the great Ming dynasty. However, in order to achieve this goal, there were some problems that had to be solved. One of the problems that needed to be solved was the problem of Yang Chendong. On one point, Zhu Qiu and Zhu Qizhen had the same idea. They were both somewhat afraid of the existence of Yang Chendong and the mercenaries behind him. Zhu Qiu would never forget who was the one who forced Wala's army to retreat. He still remembered that at that time, when all the generals and soldiers under his command were helpless, it was Yang Chendong who took the initiative to stand up and easily made Wala retreat. At that time, Zhu Qiu was still very grateful to Yang Chendong. If it was not for him, Bai Ming would have long ceased to exist. It was because of this that he was given the title of Duke of Loyalty. Now, the northern Ming dynasty was at peace, but Yang Chendong's power and influence were getting bigger and bigger. This made Zhu Qiu very tired of it. She even became a little worried about personal gains and losses. It was because of this that when Jin Ying and the others proposed to send people to assassinate Yang Chendong, Zhu Qiu did not stop them. Instead, he tacitly agreed to all of this. However, he never expected that even though he had sent out quite a few people, he still could not find a suitable opportunity. It seemed like this Duke of Loyalty also knew that he had offended too many people. Normally, his security measures were very good, making it difficult for others to make a move. Those who sent out people could not find a suitable opportunity. Fortunately, Yang Chendong actually took the initiative to send troops to Jiaoji. When he first received this news, Zhu Qiu was overjoyed. He thought that this was because some people were overconfident. However, who would have thought that Jiaoji, which the great Ming had no choice but to give up by force, would actually be forcefully opened up by Yang Chendong and his mercenaries? Not only that, they even occupied the capital. He originally thought that Yang Chendong was in great danger, and that he might even be defeated and killed without him making a move. Zhu Qiu began to make preparations to take over the immortal abode and realm beyond heaven. This was especially true of the Yang family's bank. The amount of money in there was already enough to make Zhu Qiu drool. This was something that couldn't be helped. Many merchants who had business dealings with the realm beyond heaven had to first deposit their money with the Yang family's bank. They could only do business with the bank's banknotes. This was not only the case for ordinary merchants of the Great Ming. Even the merchants of the Wala had to follow the same rules. This greatly increased the scale and influence of the Yang family's bank. The amount of gold and silver deposited there exceeded 40 million taels, enough to surpass the amount of money in Bai Ming's national treasury. Zhu Qiu had always been watching the development of the Yang family's bank with the cold eye of a bystander. He was only waiting for the right opportunity to take over the bank. When news of Yang Chendong's mercenaries entering Jiaoji arrived, he believed that the opportunity had arrived. He had sent out quite a few people to keep an eye on the Yang family's bank, precisely to prevent them from suddenly transferring their money. However, not only had Yang Chendong not been defeated in Jiaoji, he had even won one battle after another. This made Zhu Qiu's originally blazing heart feel as if it had been doused with cold water, instantly cooling down. Emperor Daizong was naturally drenched in cold sweat. If he really had been impatient and taken the Yang family's bank for himself, wouldn't he have offended Yang Chendong to the extreme? If that had happened, Bai Ming would have been in deep trouble. Putting aside whether or not Zhu Qiu truly feared Yang Chendong, at the very least, he didn't want to fight with him right now. At the very least, before his new army was fully trained and firearms were manufactured, he needed to develop steadily. Pass down the decree. Have those keeping an eye on the Yang family's bank, the realm beyond heaven, the immortal abode, and the Yang family manor withdraw. Zhu Qiu's expression was somewhat unsightly. His voice was somewhat weak as he spoke to the head eunuch Jin Ing. Your Majesty, should we send them all back? Or should we leave half of our men to keep an eye on them? After all, the situation in Jiaoji is constantly changing. Moreover, news has come from the southern Ming Empire that Emperor Yingzong has already taken action to prevent the Duke of Loyalty from interfering in Jiaoji's war, Jin Ing asked carefully. Of course, he was also voicing his own suggestions. When Zhu Qiu thought of the news from the southern Ming Empire, he couldn't help but nod. Even so, there's no need to leave half of our men behind. Just leave a small portion to keep an eye on them. In any case, don't draw their ire for now. This subject understands. Jin Ing nodded, then silently withdrew. In less than half a day, the people keeping an eye on Yang Chendong's businesses in the capital had all disappeared. It was as if they had never been there, blending into the sea of people and disappearing without a trace. 15 li south of the capital, in the Yang family manor, a carriage sped through the gates. Even though Yang Chendong had already left the Yang family manor for several months, the security here was still very high. Even this carriage bearing the Yang family's banner had to go through at least 3 security checks before it was allowed to enter the manor. As soon as it entered the Yang family manor, the sound of reading could be heard from afar. It was the sound coming from the Yang family academy. After spending enough money, Yang Chendong had hired a few scholars to teach here. Other than them, Yang Chendong students like Wang Si had also stayed here to become teachers, continuing to spread the ideology of the Yang family. The carriage stopped in front of the inner courtyard of the Yang family manor. Then, a fat man walked out from within. Young Master Fu, second madam is waiting for you in the main hall of the front courtyard. Please follow me. The person who welcomed him was Yang Si, one of the main pillars that Yang Chendong had left behind. The person who was called Young Master Fu was naturally Yang Chendong's cousin, Yang Fu. He was already the person in charge of the Yang family's business. His body was much fatter than when he was in Jianing Prefecture, but at the same time, he had the aura of a superior. Thinking about it, even Walla merchants couldn't help but flatter him when they saw him. He was an existence that didn't dare to offend. In this kind of environment, he naturally had a powerful aura. However, this aura was only useful in the business world. Speaking of which, when he came to the Yang family manor, he restrained it as much as he could. At this moment, he was smiling kindly at Yang Si. Then I'll have to trouble brother Yang Si. Yang Fu was here to see second Madam Qiao Yin. This personal servant who had followed the 6th young master since Yang was taken in as a concubine and stayed in the Yang family manor, became Yang Chendong's representative. Every once in a while, a person in power like Yang Chendong would come to report on the situation at hand. Then, the second madam would send someone to gather the information and send it to Yang Chendong, who was far away in the southern Ming Empire. Young Master Fu, you're welcome. Yang Si also smiled and said. Then the two of them walked into the manor, one in front of the other. Brother Yang Si, the 6th young master won the battle in Jiaoji. Even those ignorant people in the vicinity have lessened by a lot. Just thinking about it makes me happy. Yang Fu walked into the courtyard with his somewhat heavy body while expressing his good mood. Yes. Some people just don't learn from their mistakes. If the sixth young master was here, they wouldn't have the chance to show themselves. Now that they've left, they must have been frightened. Yang Si also chuckled. 2 hours ago, he had already received the news that the number of people watching them outside the manor and around the Yang family's businesses in the city had lessened significantly. This made Yang Si let out a long sigh of relief, and at the same time, felt the burden on his shoulders lighten. Chapter 5:15. All of this was the result of Yang Chendong's victories. Yang Fu thought that with these victories as a foundation, his business would be better and he would be able to earn more money. He could no longer hide the happiness on his face. All of these were the effects of Yang Chendong's arrival in the Jiaoji kingdom. At this moment, in Hanoi City, Yang Chendong had gathered a group of military officers for a meeting to discuss the upcoming battle tomorrow. It had been exactly 8 days since they entered Hanoi City. In these 8 days, the city had gone from chaos to normalcy. Of course, this was due to the suppression of iron and blood. At the same time, it was also due to Hong Jin and Ruan Chunqing, the former subjects of the Jiaoji kingdom, who had played an important role. Needless to say, Hong Jin had already sold his life to Yang Chendong. Now, he had even become the general of the Jiaoji mercenary army. He had 30,000 men under him. Although the army was formed at the last minute and there was still room for improvement, 30,000 men was still enough to intimidate the commoners. As for Ruan Chunqing, he was the one who took the initiative to step forward. After occupying Hanoi City, Yang Chendong sent someone to send Ruan Chunqing over from Beidao City. The moment the Prime Minister of Jiaoji walked into the capital, he could smell the stench of blood in the air and the blood that had yet to be cleaned up. As the Prime Minister of a country, Ruan Chunqing had a heart that empathized with the commoners. Seeing his subjects being slaughtered because of resistance, he could not bear to see them being slaughtered. He took the initiative to ask Yang Chendong that he was willing to work with the commoners of Jiaoji to make them more obedient. Yang Chendong was naturally satisfied with Ruan Chunqing's initiative. He immediately put him and Hong Jin in charge of public security and the people's well-being. Needless to say, using foreigners to control foreigners was very effective. Many of the unsettled citizens of Jiaoji calmed down under the guidance of their countrymen, and the security in the city began to improve. In addition, a large number of adult males were recruited into the Jiaoji mercenary army, and a portion of them were separated and brought to Ryukyu Island via Beidai City and Chu-I City. As a result, the unstable aura in the city was suppressed. Naturally, there were still opposing forces. After all, there were more than 200,000 Jiaoji citizens in the city. However, the 47,000 cultured youths of Crimson City were not just for show. They roamed the streets and alleys every day, using their glib tongues to persuade the people of Jiaoji whenever they saw them. For ordinary people, this kind of lobbying was very effective. They valued their own lives more than anything else. As for who would rule over them, there were very few people who would risk their lives to resist under the general trend. It had to be said that slavery existed in any country and region. Now that the law and order in the city had been stabilized, the next thing to do was to fend off outsiders. Today, the military officers were called over to make a decision on the next step of the military plan. All the military camps above the company level and auxiliary battalion level were allowed to participate in today's military meeting. The meeting was held in the Palace Hall of Jiaoji. The hall was spacious enough that it was still somewhat empty even with dozens of officials present. Yang Chendong was naturally seated at the head of the table. On his left was Tiger's Mane, and on his right was Beta Persei. This made his identity stand out even more. In fact, this time he was facing his own people. Logically speaking, Yang Chendong did not have to put on airs. However, as the Yang family's army grew stronger, the concept of hierarchy naturally became more and more rigid. Based on the idea of a combination of political and military orders, if an army wanted to develop, there could be many ideas, but in the end, there could only be one voice. Otherwise, Such an army would sooner or later encounter a huge problem. Sitting at the head of the table, Yang Chendong was analyzing the current situation for the military officers who came to participate in the meeting. Jiaoxi's capital has been taken down by us. I'm sure it must be shocking. As soon as this sentence was said, there was a burst of laughter from below. It was obvious that everyone was laughing with pride. Yang Chendong also laughed. In his opinion, since they had done something to be proud of, why couldn't they laugh with pride? Therefore, he accompanied everyone and laughed for a while. When he felt the laughter gradually die down, he put away his smile and said seriously, "But just taking down a capital is far from enough. This is only the first step in our journey to the outside world. If everyone is satisfied now, I have to say that there will be many things that can satisfy you in the future. But I wonder if everyone wants to maintain the current situation? Or do you want to make new contributions until one day, your names resound throughout the world and be admired and worshipped by future generations? Make new contributions." Almost everyone said in unison. It was obvious that everyone was not satisfied. Especially after the process of achieving victory was not difficult, they naturally wanted to make more contributions. It would be best if they could leave a heavy mark in the history books. Fame and fortune had always been what people pursued. Even professional soldiers were no exception. All right, since that is the case, I'm sure everyone has rested enough. Let's discuss how to fight our way out tomorrow and make new contributions. Yang Chendong was waiting for everyone to say this. Since everyone's opinions were unified, he would not be polite. He stood up and walked to the sand table of Jiaoxi's military terrain. Then he pointed at the sand table with a wooden stick and said, "Scouts report that in the northwest of Hanoi, Shiyu City, a total of 250,000 Jiaoxi soldiers are gathered there. Among them, there are the elite elephant soldiers and the black soldiers who just returned from Langsun. Their combat strength is estimated to be at level 2. With a wave of his right hand, he pointed at Yinglu City west of Hanoi and continued, "There are 100,000 reinforcements from the Lansong Kingdom stationed there. The general leading them is called La Ti. His ability is average. The quality of his troops is also average. Their combat strength is estimated to be at level 3. Su Yunxing, you tell us about La Ti's personal information and the details of the Jiaoxi army." After Yang Chendong gave a rough description, he threw the question to the young man standing at the side. Su Yunxing, the platoon leader of the reconnaissance platoon, was equivalent to a scout general. Due to his outstanding performance, he started as a scout, then became a deputy squad leader, then a squad leader, then a deputy platoon leader, then a platoon leader. After the reconnaissance platoon expanded, he became the 1st company commander. He was directly under the command of the 2nd Regiment of the Cold Front. This time, he came to Hanoi from the rainforest of Langsun after combining all the reports of the scouts. After more than 20 days, he cooperated with Wu Sheng, the commander of the 1st Battalion of the Cold Front, to kill tens of thousands of Jiaoxi soldiers in Langsun. Among them, Ruan Genwang's troops numbered around 15,000. Even Chen Heijin, one of the famous generals of Jiaoxi, had killed around 8,000 Jiaoxi soldiers. In fact, Battalion Commander Wu Sheng had only brought a little over 1,000 soldiers. 1,000 of them entangled the enemy's army of 60,000 and killed 23,000 in 20 days. Just this result alone was enough to make everyone speechless. It also allowed Wu Sheng to solidify his position as the battalion commander of the 1st Battalion. Once the Cold Front needed to expand, it would be logical for him to take another step forward. Didn't Su Yunxing get promoted from platoon leader to company commander because of his cooperation and timely report? This time, when Yang Chendong directly called him out to introduce the situation, Su Yunxing was very excited. Fortunately, he already knew the situation, so he didn't make any mistakes because of his excitement. "Everyone, let me introduce the 100,000 soldiers of the Lansong Kingdom. Their leader is called La Ti from the Liaoting tribe." The Lansong Kingdom was mainly made up of 3 factions. The strongest was the Liaoting tribe, followed by the Liaoting tribe, and lastly, the Liaoting tribe. This time, King Lili had seated Lu Rong, Shiwan and Renan prefectures in Jiaoji to request for the Lansong kingdom to send reinforcements. The one who came was the general of the Liaoting tribe, He. This person was in his early 30s, and his martial arts were not bad. He had also read a few military books, and could be considered a valiant general of the Lansong kingdom. However, it was precisely because this person was brave and resourceful that he had big ambitions. He wanted to raise the status of the Liaoting tribe in the Lansong kingdom. Sending reinforcements to Jiaoji this time was also his wish. He wanted to perform well and get on the good side of King Lili. For this reason, even though they were nominally the Liaoting tribe of the Great Ming dynasty, they still sent reinforcements without the Great Ming Emperor's orders. Not only did they send out 100,000 soldiers, they also used the resources of the Liaoting tribe. Among them, there were 5,000 cavalrymen and 5,000 master archers. Speaking of which, the master archers of the Liaoting tribe were all proficient in using bows and arrows. Not only could they easily shoot arrows up to 100 meters away, they could also hit their targets. They were quite capable. Of course, a general like this who had always wanted something was also his weakness. If he did well, he could become a weak point that could be attacked. Back to the Jiaoji army. After General Chen Heijin's black soldiers received King Lili's order to retreat to Shiyu City, the number of Jiaoji army soldiers there had reached 250,000. Just the elite soldiers alone numbered 100,000. Among them were 20,000 elephant soldiers, 25,000 black soldiers, 20,000 crown soldiers, and 35,000 king's guards. This was especially true for the king's guards. Their shield-bearers were equipped with iron shields forged from fine iron. In addition, they also had 10 iron carriages that could be moved at any time. Although they were too cumbersome and moved a little slowly, to an ordinary army, they could be considered as having a body of diamond and were difficult to break through. After Su Yunsheng finished speaking, he saluted Yang Chendong and took a step back. It was time to keep a low profile and do things in a low-key manner. Chapter 5:16. Following Su Yunsheng's detailed explanation of the enemy's strength, the officers below began to whisper to each other. For example, 2nd Battalion Commander Chen Bo and 3rd Battalion Commander Kong Chuanxin were exchanging opinions with their subordinates from time to time. Obviously, they were already considering how to fight. After allowing the officers to discuss for the time it took to brew a cup of tea, Yang Chendong put down the teacup in his hand and calmly sat down on the chair. How is it? Does anyone have any good ideas? In ancient times, when a general went to war, he would usually discuss with a few of his close subordinates before deciding on the battle plan. After gathering everyone together, he would immediately announce the battle plan. This was the fastest way to achieve results. Otherwise, if he really gathered all the Kiliarchs and Centurions together for a discussion, it would be difficult to achieve any results. Furthermore, the ancient army seemed to be used to obeying orders. Usually, whatever the higher-ups said, the subordinates would act accordingly. If they were really asked to come up with ideas or use their brains, most of them would be uncultured people. They wouldn't be able to come up with any good ideas and would only spoil the situation. In Yang Chendong's case, he really wanted to break this habit. What he wanted was for everyone to participate. He wanted everyone to get used to using their brains in battle. It didn't matter if they were right or wrong. After all, they still needed democratic centralism. As long as the commanders didn't make any mistakes, it would be fine. They were already used to Yang Chendong's style. When they were asked if they had any ideas, the officers began to express their opinions. Chief, I think we should pick on the weaker ones and attack the Liaoting tribe of the Lansong kingdom first. No, with our strength, how can we bully the weak and fear the strong? We should deal with the Jiaoji army first. Yes, as long as we scare the Jiaoji army, that La Ti won't be a problem. He would probably run away with his tail between his legs. The third person's voice was quickly followed by a burst of laughter from the other officers. The atmosphere became much more lively. But in general, the difference in opinion was whether to attack the Jiaoji army or the Liaoting tribe first. After all, although the mercenaries had advanced firearms, there were too few of them. It was unrealistic for them to fight both of them at once. Yang Chendong looked like he was seriously listening to their opinions. After the time it took for 2 incense sticks to burn, most of the officers below had expressed their opinions, and the voices of discussion had quieted down. He cleared his throat and turned to look at Cold Front 2nd Battalion's Battalion Commander Chen Bo. Battalion Commander Chen, I didn't see you say anything earlier. What do you think? Chen Bo, whose name was called, stood up from his seat. His eyes were not focused. Obviously, he was still thinking about the problem. Chen Bo was called Confucian General by Yang Chendong. This was because he was different from the other officers in terms of height and strength. Although he was not tall, he had more of a scholarly air and less of a valiant aura. Perhaps this had something to do with his love of reading. Because he loved reading, he liked to think more when he encountered problems. He was always willing to ask more questions or make more hypotheses. Just like earlier, he was constantly making hypotheses until Yang Chendong called him to stand up. Then, his thoughts started to come together. 6th Young Master, if it were up to me, I would prefer to beat the Liaoting tribe into submission first. After all, it shouldn't be too difficult to deal with them. Otherwise, we won't be able to deal with the Jiaoji army with our full strength. Also, we won't be able to get used to having someone watching us from behind. Then do you have any ideas? Looking at Chen Bo, Yang Chendong had an intuition that he should have thought of a plan to retreat. As expected, Chen Bo quickly nodded his head and said, 6th Young Master, this is what I think. Since they took the initiative to become enemies with us mercenaries, it's not enough to just teach them a lesson. Instead, we should completely defeat them. It would be best if we could wipe them all out and let them remember this lesson. From then on, whenever we mention the name of mercenaries, they would feel their entire body tremble. Only this way can we warn the future generations and let them know what kind of attitude they should maintain when facing us again. After Chen Bo said these words, it gave Yang Chendong a feeling that he was planning something big. It was not difficult for him to be curious and said, Go on. 6th Young Master, what do you think? Isn't the Navy attacking Sunan County from Jiuzhen County? I heard that the progress is very smooth. Then, can you let them make a stance? Let's make it look like they are marching towards the Lansong Kingdom from the Changshan mountain range. We just need to make a big commotion. Presumably, if the commotion is enough, they will definitely return to their country for the sake of their own safety. At that time, we can attack them halfway and achieve twice the result with half the effort. Taking the initiative to walk in front of the sand table, Chen Bo explained his idea in detail. Then he looked at Yang Chendong with an expectant look. Yang Chendong was also interested in Chen Bo's idea. To be honest, it's only 100,000 Laotian soldiers. They don't really pose a threat to Yang Chendong. If he really needs to pacify the Jiaoji army, he can just lead the army to the west. It won't be difficult to kill the Laotian soldiers. So what he wants to do is to intercept the Laotian soldiers halfway and deal with them. But if he really does that, the most he can do is to chase them away. If he wants to hurt them, it will be a bit difficult. On the contrary, Chen Bo's plan was completely different. First, he would mobilize them, and then intercept them when they had no choice but to retreat. In this way, it was possible to achieve the possibility of seriously injuring the enemy, or even annihilating the enemy. Moreover, by waiting for the exhausted enemy to arrive, the price to pay would only be smaller. As for the need to mobilize the Navy, that is even less of a problem. Didn't Chen Bo just say it? They just need to make a commotion, there is no need to really send out troops. Okay, I will leave this matter to the 2nd Battalion. How many troops do you need? Yang Chendong quickly made a decision. This is how a commander is, being indecisive will often lead to chaos. Moreover, even if this plan doesn't work, he won't lose anything. He will just treat it as a long-range training for the army. Seeing that Yang Chendong agreed, Chen Bo was also very excited. Previously, when the 3rd Battalion commander Kong Chuanxin took down the capital of Jiaoji, Hanoi, he was very envious. Although he also took down Beidai City, it was a defenseless city compared to Kong Chuanxin. He didn't even fire a few shots, the sense of accomplishment was too small. But if he can take down 100,000 Laotian soldiers, it will be completely different. That will be a real military merit. 6th Young Master, if possible, other than the 2nd Battalion, I would like to mobilize 2 auxiliary battalions, 5 temporary auxiliary battalions, and 10,000 Jiaoji mercenaries. After saying this, Chen Bo also purposely explained, I want to take down all 100,000 Laotian soldiers. If the number is too small, I am afraid that I can only defeat and cripple them, but not all of them. Approved. Yang Chendong nodded decisively. Chen Bo's request was not low, but it also proved his confidence. Just as he said, if they wanted to take down 100,000 Laotian soldiers, it would be impossible if the number was too small. Thank you, 6th Young Master. Don't worry, if I can't take down 100,000 Laotian soldiers this time, I will start from scratch. Seeing how much Yang Chendong trusted him, Chen Bo said emotionally. He was probably the first person other than Yang Chendong to lead 10,000 Laotian soldiers to battle, so it was normal for him to be emotional. With Chen Bo's promise, the other officers who wanted to fight for a chance all shut their mouths. This was especially true for 3rd Battalion Commander Kong Chuanxin. He didn't want to fall behind others. Since 2nd Battalion Commander Chen Bo could do this well, why couldn't he? Although he didn't quite understand the specific battle plan of the other party, as long as he had the idea, he could study the details later. However, all of this changed after hearing Chen Bo's promise. Compared to Chen Bo's courage and willingness to stake everything on a single throw, Kong Chuanxin was much less confident. With the plan to deal with the 100,000 Laotian soldiers, the following meeting was much simpler. Yang Chendong announced that other than leaving behind 2,000 Jiaoji mercenaries and 1 auxiliary camp to defend Hanoi City, the rest of the 20,000-plus troops would set out for Shiyu City the next morning. He wanted to make a show of an all-out attack, luring the 100,000 Laotian troops under Ruthi so to send out their troops. After the meeting, Recon Company Commander Su Changxing sent out scouts towards Rinan Prefecture, informing Nye Tong to send out a portion of his men to cross the Changshan Mountains and attack the Lan Tsong Kingdom. After resting for 8 days, the mercenaries left from the north gate of Hanoi City with renewed vigor the next morning. They headed straight for Shiyu City, which was less than 200 miles away. The commander was naturally Yang Chendong. Beside him was the 2nd Regiment Commander of Lung Feng, Luope. However, this regiment commander was a little pitiful, as he only had a 3rd Battalion, a regiment commander, and a regiment commander left. Even so, they were still the main force. Following Yang Chendong towards Shiyu City were 7 auxiliary battalions and 7 temporary battalions, as well as 18,000 Jiaoji mercenaries. The 25,000-strong army marched out of the city. Soon, their whereabouts were known by the Jiaoji scouts stationed nearby. The news spread like wildfire across the land of Jiaoji. A war to defend and a war to wipe out a nation was about to begin. On the same night that Yang Chendong led the army out of the north gate, the west gate of Hanoi City opened from the inside. Chen Bo brought his 2nd Battalion, 2 auxiliary battalions, 5 temporary battalions, and 10,000 Jiaoji mercenaries led by General Hong Jin out of the city, disappearing into the darkness. In order to complete the mission better, Chen Bo requested for General Hong Jin to come over. After all, the 10,000 Jiaoji mercenaries had played a huge role in keeping the 100,000 Laotian soldiers in Jiaoji. If they did not have a good commander, how could they succeed? Chapter 517. Shiyu City. The news of the mercenary army leaving the city had already reached here. King Li, who had regained his power, called for an emergency meeting. He called all the officials before him to discuss the strategy of retreating the enemy. Around 25,000 people? They increased the number of troops again? After hearing the report of the number of enemy troops, Crown Prince Li Yuanlong was the first to lose his composure and asked this question. It was no wonder that he was so surprised. Previously, the news said that the mercenary army was only around 10,000. Now that there was an increase of nearly half, it was reasonable for him to be surprised. This was the disadvantage of having outdated information. Ever since they gave up on Hanoi City, there was no more news about it. Many of the spies that were left in the city were dug out. There were some who were lucky enough not to be discovered and were sent out of Hanei City. They went to the seaside and went straight to Ryukyu Island. They became miserable spies that couldn't be helped no matter how much they cried. Without internal information, they naturally didn't know that Hong Jin had formed a Jiaoji mercenary army of 30,000 people. In fact, it wasn't just Crown Prince Li Yuanlong who was shocked. The other officials were also shocked. The 10,000 mercenary army was already a headache for them. They even lost the capital. Now that the mercenary army had doubled in strength, how were they going to deal with it? On the other hand, although King Lily was shocked, he didn't show it on his face. After all, he was the king of a country. If he panicked, then wouldn't the rest of the country be in chaos? What are you panicking for? Seeing the panic on the faces of the officials, even Crown Prince Li Yuanlong wasn't as calm as before. Li Li's face was dark as he spoke. When everyone's gazes turned to him, he calmly said, "How about this? Immediately send someone to inform General Ati. Tell them to move closer to us. If possible, bite the tail of the mercenary army. When the time is right, we will launch a pincer attack. By the way, tell him to be careful and not to be targeted by others." The king is wise. When the officials heard that they were going to ally with General Ati, they all relaxed. That's right, didn't they have reinforcements? In total, there were 350,000 soldiers. Compared to the 20,000 mercenaries, they had a 20 times advantage in terms of numbers. Furthermore, they were on the defensive. It seemed that there was no possibility of them losing. Some of the civil and military officials felt much more at ease after hearing the king's words. However, there were still some people who were terrified. This included the crown prince, Li Yuanlong. In the past, he had been able to act calmly and unhurriedly because he had the Jiuzhen County as his foundation. As long as the Jiuzhen County was not in chaos, he would have an escape route and reinforcements. But now, even that place was occupied by the mercenaries. He had lost his foundation. A crown prince without a foundation would lack confidence in whatever he did. The news of the mercenaries suddenly leaving Hanoi City and heading straight for Shiyu City naturally reached the ears of General Ati of the Lan Song Kingdom in a very short time. Since he had arrived in Jiaoji, Ruthi was prepared to fight the mercenaries. Seeing that everything was happening as he had expected, he began to mobilize and gather his troops before the battle. The distance from Shiyu City to Yinglu City where Ruthi was located was less than 400 li. Soon, the scouts sent by the king of Lily arrived. After receiving the signal from the king of Jiaoji, Ruthi led 95,000 soldiers out of Yinglu City and rushed behind the mercenaries. He left 5,000 soldiers to guard Yinglu City. In addition, there were 2,000 Jiaoji soldiers in the city. There should not be any problems guarding the city. Ruthi even hoped that someone would attack the city. That way, he could quickly return and launch a pincer attack from both the inside and outside of the city to teach the mercenaries a lesson. However, what he did not expect was that the mercenaries had no intention of attacking the city. Yang Chendong had said more than once that if you keep the people and lose the land, you would gain the people and the land. If you keep the land, you would lose the people and the land. According to Yang Chendong, the main goal was to eliminate the enemy's strength. As long as the main army of Jiaoji was eliminated, the cities could not be moved. Wouldn't that mean that the mercenaries could occupy the cities whenever they wanted? Ruthi led the army out of the city. However, the marching speed was not very fast. It was only about 20 li a day. This way, they could better maintain the discipline of the troops. With the front and rear looking after each other, if any of the troops were attacked, they could ensure that they would rush to the rescue as quickly as possible. The 5,000 cavalrymen under his command were used as a rapid response force. Of course, the reason why they were so slow was because of the news from the front. The 20,000 mercenaries did not attack immediately after arriving at Shiyu City. Instead, they stopped 10 li outside of the city and looked like they were in a standoff. Although Ruthi did not understand why the mercenaries did not attack immediately, he did not think too much about it. In his opinion, this was his chance. Once he could successfully move behind the mercenaries, it would be time for him to work with the Jiaoji army to launch a pincer attack. He didn't believe that with over 300,000 soldiers pressing down, and with the front and rear attacking together, the other side's 20,000 soldiers could do anything. It could be said that until now, neither King Lili nor General Ruthi suspected that the mercenaries had split up. They did not know that the Jiaoji mercenaries alone accounted for 18,000 of the 20,000 mercenaries. At the same time, the commander of the 2nd Marine Regiment, Nye Tong, received the order and led 2 battalions of soldiers towards the Changshan mountain range. Although there were not many soldiers, in order to create enough momentum, each squad raised a sun and moon flag of the Great Ming Dynasty. From afar, it looked like the flags were fluttering in the wind and the morale was high. The discovery of the mercenaries in the east of the Lan Tsang Kingdom frightened the king of the Lan Tsang Kingdom, Paiyasai. Paiyasai inherited his father's position and became the new king of Lan Tsang Kingdom. Under his rule, the kingdom was considered stable. However, because the territory was too small, they could not find a good opportunity to expand. When the mercenaries suddenly appeared in Jiaoji, they took note of it. After all, Jiaoji was their neighbor and their territory was not small. It had always been one of the goals that the Lan Tsang Kingdom wanted to expand. Originally, they wanted to wait for the Jiaoji army and the mercenaries to fight to the point where both sides were heavily injured before they made a move. However, they did not expect that the small mercenaries would be so powerful and win consecutive battles. In the end, the Jiaoji army even lost their kingdom. If the two sides were evenly matched, a third party might have a chance. However, when one side could only take a beating, there would not be a chance to take advantage of the situation. Just as King Paiyasai was having a headache about how the mercenaries were so strong, King Lili's messenger arrived. He even brought a letter from the king of Jiaoji asking for help. In the letter, King Lili first expressed his sincere greetings to King Paiyasai and then pointed out that the situation in Jiaoji was not going well. He requested that the Lan Tsang Kingdom send troops to help out on account of the fact that they had been neighbors for generations. He also promised that after the war, he would give the 3 prefectures to the Lan Tsang Kingdom. At the same time, he also said that the mercenaries were too strong. If they were not restrained, they would deal with the Lan Tsang Kingdom the same way they dealt with the Jiaoji Kingdom today. This was the logic behind the saying, "When the lips are cold, the teeth will die." King Lili's words made sense. In addition, the 3 prefectures could be given to the Lan Tsang Kingdom. This was a good thing for the development of the Lan Tsang Kingdom. Of course, the most important thing was that he did not have a clear understanding of the mercenaries' strength. A flintlock? This sounded very powerful. King Paiyasai, who had seen them before, started to look down on them. In his opinion, Jiaoji was the strength of a kingdom. It was impossible to conquer it with just 10,000 mercenaries. As time passed, they might even solve the problem themselves. If that was the case, the benefits of the 3 prefectures would be lost. Completely ignoring the word advanced in firearms, Paiyasai made a decision that he would regret for the rest of his life. He agreed to send 100,000 soldiers to support Jiaoji. Previously, the war happened within the borders of Jiaoji. No matter how intense the war was, King Paiyasai did not have any direct knowledge of it, until he suddenly received news that the mercenaries had entered from the Long Mountain Range and were heading straight for the capital, Wanxiang City. Furthermore, there was news from the front lines that a border patrol of 500 people encountered the mercenaries. However, in just one encounter, they were defeated and left behind 300 corpses. All of this was Commander Nye Tong's idea. In order to make the Lan Tsang Kingdom afraid, not only did they have to advance with great fanfare, they also had to fight at least 2 battles. Although the navy could display their strength on the sea, this did not stop them from dealing with small groups of enemies on land. Just like this Lan Tsang Kingdom patrol team, they were unlucky enough to become the target of the 2 cold front battalions. Under the 95 styles rotating guns, how could 500 people be a match? The sudden appearance of the mercenaries caused the upper echelons of the Lan Tsang Kingdom to panic. Thinking that it was better to die than to die, King Paiyasai ordered General Ati to lead the troops back to the kingdom. The Lan Tsang Kingdom's army of 95,000 people had advanced for 5 days. Initially, they were worried that the mercenaries would appear to intercept them. But now, they had advanced for 100 miles without encountering any enemies. General Lati's alertness was constantly decreasing. He even began to consider whether he could speed up the march and attack the mercenaries with the Jiaoji army. Suddenly, the king's order arrived. Chapter 5:18. Seeing the letter in the messenger's hand, King Piusai's handwritten letter, King Lati only hesitated for a moment before deciding to lead his troops back to the country. Even though helping Jiaoji win the war was a great achievement, if the Lansong kingdom was severely damaged, all of his achievements would become a stain on his reputation. Worse still, the old dragon tribe would take this opportunity to make things difficult for him. General Lati, who didn't want to give anyone a chance to criticize him, quickly ordered his troops to turn around and retreat. He didn't even inform Jiaoji. It was clear how anxious he was. Compared to the 20 miles a day they traveled on the way to Yinglu City, the speed of the army was much faster. After all, no one knew what would happen to the Lansong kingdom if they delayed for another day. Perhaps the mercenaries had already clashed with the kingdom's army. While General Lati was leading his troops back, in a place called the Wuha Forest, mines were being watered by the summer rain. In the dense forest of the Wuha Forest, the troops of the 2nd Battalion commander of the 2nd Cold Front Regiment, Chen Bo, were hidden. 3 days ago, he led more than 10,000 soldiers to this place. After choosing this place as the ambush location, they began digging the mines intensively. In a short period of time, countless deep holes were dug on both sides of the road to place a total of 3,000 mines. In less than half a day, the mines were successfully placed. Next, everyone returned to their respective positions. Along the Wulin River, the 10,000 soldiers hid themselves and began a long wait. They brought with them 10 days' worth of rations, which mainly consisted of instant noodles, ham sausages, and various canned food. Every soldier was either eating or sleeping. It was a leisurely scene. However, as the commander, Chen Bo found it difficult to truly sleep soundly. From time to time, he would look into the distance to see if the scouts had sent back any new information. "It's raining." In the dense forest, someone called out softly. Then, Chen Bo raised his head and looked at the sky. What he saw was a drizzle falling from the sky. "Okay." Chen Bo couldn't help but clench his fists in excitement as he watched the drizzle fall on the trees and drip onto himself. Previously, he was still worried that he would leave some traces behind when he buried the mines and be discovered by others. But now that the rain was falling from the sky, everything was no longer a problem. This would be the best cover. In such weather, even the best scout would find it difficult to discover any problems. Not long after the light rain fell, a figure in the distance was rapidly approaching the dense forest. The person who came was the scout that was sent out. With his return, he also brought the latest news, which was that Lati had returned with 100,000 troops. This damn weather. Riding on the horse and looking up at the sky, Ruthie couldn't help but curse. It was no wonder that Lati was so angry. One could tell just by looking at the morale of the army. Originally, the nearly 100,000 soldiers were still holding their heads high and wanted to show off their might. But now, they were suddenly ordered to turn back. This was a very discouraging thing to begin with. But then it started to drizzle. Although it wasn't very heavy, after a long time, the soldiers' clothes were soaked. The sticky feeling was very uncomfortable. The road also became muddy with the continuous drizzle. Every step they took was heavier than usual. This feeling made them feel even more uncomfortable. The morale of the entire army became much lower because of this. From afar, the army that was walking with their heads lowered would curse from time to time. They all looked like they were blaming the heavens and blaming others. However, even though the morale of the army was low, General Lati couldn't do anything. Under such weather and such orders, even if he was a great orator, he wouldn't be able to raise the morale of the army at this moment. He just hoped that they could quickly reach Yinglu City, enter the city, change into dry clothes, eat hot food, and have a good sleep. Perhaps they would feel much better after that. All troops, speed up and try to enter the city to rest at night. Thinking that they were less than 40 miles away from Yinglu City, Lottie made up his mind and gritted his teeth as he spoke to his subordinates. Soon, the order was passed down. Although they hadn't had a good rest since the beginning of the return journey, the soldiers didn't complain too much when they thought about how they could have a good sleep after entering the city. Instead, they sped up silently. At this moment, no one thought about whether they would encounter an ambush. After all, they didn't see a single enemy on the way here. Now that they were about to return to the city, they were only 40 miles away from Inglu City. In addition, the weather was bad and the sky was gradually darkening. Who would attack them at this time? Just like how it was very strenuous for them to walk, wouldn't it be the same for the enemy who wanted to attack them? It was precisely because of this misconception that the nearly 100,000 troops didn't have the slightest awareness of being on guard. On the contrary, because of the rain, the distance between the front, middle, and rear of the army was increasing. The sky slowly darkened. Perhaps it was because of the rain, but the sky was much darker than usual. It also made people feel very vexed. However, all of this didn't affect the mercenaries much. They were originally hiding in the rainforest, and the trees above them had blocked much of the wind and rain for them. In addition, they had been sleeping the entire day apart from eating, so everyone was in good spirits. At this moment, this group of elite soldiers was staring at the approaching Lan Tsang army. Even though the front of their army had already walked past them, not a single soldier had the intention to charge out and fight. Even the 10,000 Jiaoji mercenaries didn't dare to make a single sound under the strict orders of General Hong Jin. It was as if they were afraid of causing a commotion and angering the mercenaries who killed without batting an eyelid. Not to mention, before the battle, the mercenary battalion commander Chen Bo had said that as long as everyone followed the rules, after the battle was over, all the soldiers who participated in the battle would be rewarded with at least 20 taels of silver, regardless of whether they had contributed or not. 20 taels of silver was equivalent to the annual income of an ordinary family in Jiaoji. With such a reward in front of them, everyone was naturally as obedient as they could be. Naturally, only rich mercenaries would be able to casually pay out 200,000 taels of silver without feeling the slightest bit of heartache. The darkness continued. Half of the Lan Tsang army had already passed through the Wuhe forest, including the 5,000 cavalrymen and 5,000 archers. They were the main force and soul of this army of close to 100,000 men. Everyone, get ready. Through the night vision binoculars in his hands, he could clearly see the front of the army. He saw that the 5,000 cavalrymen were about to walk into a muddy area. In reality, there was a deep trench there. It was the best weapon to use against cavalrymen. As the commander, Chen Bo raised his right hand high into the air. Although the sky was a little dark, the raised right hand was still seen by many people. Their breathing became tense at this moment. Then, they focused their attention and waited for the hand to fall, then they would launch a fierce attack. The so-called attack was just shooting from a distance. According to Battalion Commander Chen Bo's plan, they could not fight the enemy head-on in this battle. They only needed to shoot from a short distance to cause chaos in the enemy army. Then, they would step on landmines to increase the chaos. As long as the enemy's morale was completely suppressed, then it would be time for them to clean up the mess. General Ati, who was unaware of all this, was still riding on his horse and moving forward. As a general, he arrogantly walked at the front. However, he did not know that his actions, which seemed like he was leading by example, was actually a catalyst to the death of nearly 100,000 soldiers. After all, if he, the main general, did not get into trouble immediately, the morale of the soldiers would not have fallen to the lowest point in such a short period of time. Bang! The trench, which was nearly 6 meters deep and 8 meters wide, collapsed. Before the cavalrymen in the first row could figure out what was going on, they fell one by one into the trench like dumplings. Next was the second row. General Ati was in this row. He only felt that the cavalryman in front of him had suddenly disappeared. Then, his body tilted and fell into the trench with a plop. Then it was the third row, the fourth row. Fortunately, the trench had a limited capacity. Otherwise, at least hundreds of cavalrymen would have fallen into the trench and lost their ability to fight. However, even if only a few hundred people fell into the trench, the consequences were considerable. This was because their commanding general and several captains beside him had fallen into the trench together. At this moment, they were still pressed down by the cavalrymen and horses that fell into the trench. It was impossible for them to move in a short period of time. Just as this chaos was about to break out, a dazzling light suddenly shot up into the sky. A very bright red signal flare streaked across the dark night sky. At this moment, the horn that signaled the beginning of the battle had been blown. Tut tut tut, bam bam bam, bam bam bam, gunshots rang out in all directions. Sparks from the muzzles suddenly appeared in all directions, dealing a fatal blow to the soldiers of the Lansong kingdom who were in a hurry to move forward. No one would have thought that there would be enemies here. No one would have thought that they would be ambushed here. No one would have thought that the attack would be so sudden and fierce. Originally, the Wuha forest was on both sides of the road. The distance in a straight line was only about 500 meters. When all kinds of bullets flew over, and when people suddenly fell to the ground in the rainy night, the army was in chaos. Chapter 5:19. It seemed to be an instinct. When people encountered an emergency, their first thought was to run. If they had to describe it, they would have to add a word in front of the word run. Chaos. That's right, they were running around. Perhaps this was the only way they could feel at ease. As long as they kept moving, they would feel safer and know that they were still alive. However, they did not know that there were 3,000 landmines buried around them. Although the number was not considered a lot, it was much less than the 10,000 landmines that Yang Chundong buried in the Liangshan rainforest to deal with Ruan Yongyang. However, it was in the middle of the night, and under the sudden attack, when one of the 3,000 scattered landmines was stepped on, the shock it brought was also very strong. Boom, 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 boom. The explosions were incessant, flames were everywhere, blood was flowing everywhere, and corpses were scattered everywhere. When all these scenes appeared, it was like a purgatory on earth. Human lives became the most worthless existence. One of the captains who was lucky enough not to be affected by the war, under the premise that he could not find General Lati, acted like an ostrich under the protection of his bodyguards while he sent people to Yinglu City, which was 40 miles away, to ask for reinforcements. In terms of numbers, there were more soldiers here. However, anyone could see that under the sudden attack, their morale was low and their morale was low. There was no way they could win a battle with such an army. If reinforcements could appear, it might be like a cardiac stimulant, raising the morale of these soldiers and turning the situation around. Those who could become 10,000 men commanders were no fools. Thinking back to the news that they had received, the mercenaries had dispatched troops from the Long Mountain Range and headed to Shiyu City to confront the Jiaoji Kingdom's army. It was unlikely that they would have many enemies after splitting up their forces. Perhaps, they still had a chance to turn the tables. However, what the major didn't know was that his actions weren't salvaging the situation. Instead, he was destroying the last bit of hope that he had. The war was still going on. Under the continuous drizzle, there were still many Lansong Kingdom soldiers who were hit and fell to the ground, losing their lives. From time to time, there would be people who stepped on landmines out of fear. Not only did they pay with their own lives, but they also caused their comrades to be sacrificed. In such a chaotic situation, it seemed that there were enemies everywhere, and nowhere was safe. Even the 5,000 so-called elite godly archers did not have the slightest bit of combat prowess in the face of such a situation. In the darkness, they could only see tongues of fire shooting out from all around them, but they couldn't see where the enemy was. Every time they wanted to walk over to take a look, bullets would shoot through their bodies before they could even get close, causing them to fall one by one. After a few more rounds, and after throwing down nearly 500 corpses, they became much more obedient. They no longer dared to recklessly probe anything. Instead, they changed from standing to lying down. This was because they discovered that once they did so, their safety was much more guaranteed. This was because the bullets from the muskets wouldn't take care of them. This discovery gave more of the Lansong Kingdom's soldiers hope of survival. Therefore, in less than an hour, all the soldiers who were still alive changed from standing to lying down. Because of this, the outside environment became much quieter than before. Unless there was someone who didn't have eyes and wanted to escape, only then would there be a few gunshots. Otherwise, it was very quiet most of the time. Although it wasn't good to lie down on the ground at this time, and many of them were even soaked by the rain and water, but compared to losing their lives, this was of course a very good result. Battalion commander, they are all lying down and not moving. Feeling that the swaying figures in their line of sight began to decrease until there were almost none, an officer reported to Chinbo, "Very good, isn't this what we want to see? Tell the soldiers, don't waste bullets. As long as they don't move, we won't move either. When dawn comes, it will be time to reap the fruits of victory. Now it's up to Chunyang and Sergeant Su." Chen Bo said calmly, but if one listened carefully, one could hear the sense of relief in his tone. Although the plan was very thorough, and they had set up an ambush here 3 days in advance. But before seeing the results, his heart had been hanging in the air. Now that there was finally a result, and it was a very good result, it was no wonder that his mood was much more relaxed. Yinglu City. As the temporary resting place of the Lansong Kingdom's reinforcements, this place was very safe. Even though General Ati had led the troops out, there were still 5,000 Lansong soldiers and 2,000 Jiaoji soldiers. A city with less than 40,000 permanent residents actually had 7,000 soldiers. This ratio was already very high. This made it so that the residents here were not too affected by the battle outside. Even if there was news that the Jiaoji Kingdom's capital had been taken over by the mercenary army, it was the same. This was because there was also news that King Lili was mobilizing a large number of troops to counterattack. Adding on the fact that 100,000 Lansong soldiers were stationed in this city, there was nothing to be afraid of. Not to mention that the mercenary army only had around 10,000 people. Since the residents were not afraid, the soldiers were even more so. Especially after General Ati led the 95,000-strong army to battle, the 7,000 soldiers who stayed behind to guard the city were living like the masters of the city. Other than closing the city gates to prevent accidents, they had been eating and sleeping for the past few days. Occasionally, they would gather together to gamble. Life was not too good. In actuality, the 5,000 people who stayed behind did not have much battle strength, and they were the weakest of the 100,000 people. As such, they did not have any military discipline. They all knew that the other soldiers had gone with the general to do meritorious deeds, and only they stayed behind. They were people who had been abandoned, and since it was like this, they decided to go all out. Adding on the fact that it had been raining for the past few days, they could drink some wine, sleep some well, and gamble some money. However, this good life was quickly disrupted. News came from the front lines that because the mercenary army had suddenly attacked the Lansong Kingdom, General Ati would no longer help the Jiaoji Kingdom and would instead go back to help his own kingdom. Moreover, he might return to the city today, so wouldn't their good days be over? Since the general was coming back, the soldiers put away their playful attitude, cleaned the barracks, and prepared food. For the entire day, the 5,000 people were very busy. Just when they were almost done with their preparations, a cavalryman suddenly arrived at the city gate with an unbelievable piece of news. General Ati and nearly 100,000 soldiers had been ambushed and suffered heavy losses. When the news came out, many people were in disbelief. If the cavalryman who came was not a Chiliarch, and he was indeed one of their own, some of the soldiers would have doubted the authenticity of this news. "Hurry up, the army is still fighting with the enemy, and we need your help now," the Chiliarch shouted at the top of the city gates. As if he was afraid that these people would delay the battle, he even shouted, "Weren't you guys regretting that you couldn't go with the army and get military merits? Now that the merits are in front of you, do you dare to fight for it?" The Chiliarch was still shouting, using his own method to provoke the 5,000 soldiers who stayed behind to guard the city. About 200 meters away from him, a few figures were lying on the ground, watching everything closely. Although it was still raining and the ground was already muddy, there were still mosquitoes flying around. Sometimes, there would even be some mosquitoes flying around in front of their faces, looking for opportunities to bite them from time to time. However, These black shadows just lay there motionless, like statues. To be able to not be affected by external factors, to have such iron discipline, who else could they be but the most elite soldiers of the Cold Vanguard Army? In fact, there were at least 200 of these black figures on the ground outside Inglu City's East Gate. They were formed by the scouts of the 2nd Regiment and the 1st Company of the 2nd Battalion. They arrived when the sky turned dark. Under the cover of the rainy night, they crawled slowly to the city gates, and then found a good place to hide. At the place closest to the East Gate, the few figures lying on the ground were the commanders of these 200 men. They were the scouts' commander Su Yunxing and the 2nd Battalion's 1st Company's commander Chun Yang. The order they received was to take down Inglu City and wipe out the 7,000 enemies in the city. Since Chen Bo had made a military order in front of Yang Chendong, saying that he was going to wipe out the 100,000 soldiers of the Lansong Kingdom, then the 5,000 Lansong soldiers guarding the city naturally had to be wiped out. Otherwise, wouldn't it be imperfect? However, the disparity between 200 and 7,000 was still a little too great. In order to complete this mission, Chen Bo gave the 2nd Battalion's 2 rocket launchers to the 1st Company's commander Chun Yang, as well as 2 squads machine guns. These were the treasures of the 2nd Battalion, and only the most elite Cold Vanguard Army was given such good stuff. Now that they were all given to the 1st Company, this was the only thing that Chin Pai could support them in. When the 2 rocket launchers and 2 squads machine guns were in his hands, Chun Yang also made a military order in front of Chin Bo, guaranteeing that he would complete the mission. Speaking of which, the 200 of them only had to face the 2,000 Jiaoji soldiers in Inglu City. With such firepower, this mission wasn't that hard to complete. At this moment, Company Commander Chunyang and Company Commander Su Yunxing were discussing the battle plan below the city gate tower. Chapter 520. Even though they were all company commanders, they seemed to be of the same rank. However, because Su Yunxing was a scout company commander directly under the regiment, his name was even registered with the 6th Young Master. In comparison, Chunyang, the company commander of the main force, was half a level lower. Because of this, Chunyang spoke in a negotiating tone. Company Commander Su, do you think we should first take control of the East Gate, then quickly take down the Jiaoji general's residence? I think so. After thinking for a moment, Su Yunxing nodded and added, I'll leave the East Gate and the general's residence to your company. I'll take the scout company to take control of the north, west, and south gates. We'll try to take control of the entire city in the shortest amount of time. Chunyang was waiting for this sentence. He immediately said to Su Yunxing with a face full of gratitude, Thank you, Company Commander Su. AI, no need to be so polite. We're all completing our mission. Su Yunxing smiled and said in a low voice, The city gate is open. Inglu City's East Gate was indeed open. After this, Chiliarch arrived on horseback and explained the situation. The 5,000 Lansong soldiers in the city finally decided to come out and help. Speaking of which, they were all from the Lauting tribe. Many of the soldiers were related by blood. They definitely wouldn't leave their loved ones in danger. The 5,000-man troop was a long line in the darkness. From the moment they left the city to the moment they all walked out of the city, it took them more than an hour. When the last batch of Lansong soldiers walked out of the city gate, the dozen or so Jiaoji soldiers in charge of security prepared to close the city gate. However, these people had no idea that their lives had already begun the countdown. The moment they pushed the city gates with all their might, wanting to close them, over 10 black figures jumped out from behind them. It was as if they had appeared out of thin air. Then, a cold light flashed, and streams of blood gushed out. Then, over 10 people slowly fell to the ground. The scouts acted. They were already prepared and quickly took care of the Jiaoji soldiers who were trying to close the city gate. Then, 2 companies of elites rushed out of the East Gate to the key locations in Inglu City. No one would have thought that the mercenaries would attack Inglu City in the middle of the night. Most of the 2,000 Jiaoji soldiers in the city had taken off their uniforms and were preparing to rest. But then, several gunshots rang out from outside. There's a situation. The gunshots startled the Jiaoji soldiers, and they hurriedly put on their clothes. Then, they grabbed their weapons and tried to rush out of the camp. Those who ran faster became the first batch of soldiers to walk out of the barracks. There were many figures in the dark. Then, torches were lit one after another. However, before they could illuminate the dark night, a series of rapid gunshots were heard. This was the sound of the squad's machine gun firing. This kind of gun that could fire 600 bullets in a minute was like a divine weapon in this era. Once he took it out, he would definitely be able to kill in all directions, and it would be difficult for him to find a worthy opponent. A series of gunshots rang out, and the first batch of Jiaoji soldiers fell into a pool of blood. Even when they were dying, they didn't understand what had happened. The dozens of Jiaoji soldiers who died were like role models, causing the other Jiaoji soldiers who wanted to rush out to stop. They were all frightened by the scene in front of them. This fear made them lose the courage to rush out of the camp, and they didn't even have the strength to light the torches. There were at least 1,500 Jiaoji soldiers in the camp. When they were scared into staying in the camp and didn't dare to come out, the matters outside were much easier to handle. Other than the two Lengfeng platoons who stayed outside the camp, Chang Chunyang led the remaining platoon of soldiers and charged into the general's residence. The gunshots outside caused the gates of the general's residence to be tightly shut from the inside. General Ying Lu's shouting could be heard from the inside. However, the tightly shut door was no different from a piece of paper in Leng Feng's eyes. He saw Captain Chunyang reach out and take the rocket launcher from a soldier. Then, with a loud bang, the tightly shut door was blown apart. The Jiaoji soldiers who were using their bodies to push against the door were sent flying. A few of them had already closed their eyes and stopped breathing while they were flying. Charge! After the door was blasted open, Chunyang pointed his hand forward and the valiant Cold Vanguard soldiers entered in a single file. A series of gunshots rang out, and in less than the time it took to drink a cup of tea, the general's residence was captured. Even General Ying Lu had become a corpse on the ground. If the general's residence was opened by brute force, then the Jiaoji soldiers on the western, southern, and northern city towers were beaten into submission by a roll call. To be able to become a scout, not only were they physically strong, their observation skills were also top-notch. Their training had taught them what it meant to protect themselves and attack the enemy at the same time. Therefore, they understood the value of life. When Company Commander Su Yunxing gave the order to the 3 platoons to attack freely, they actually chose the same method. They didn't attack the city towers, and only occupied the city gates. Not attacking the city towers meant that they didn't want to put themselves in danger. It could also be said that there was no need to take the risk. Their mission was only to control the 3 city gates. Since that was the case, they only needed to prevent the Jiaoji soldiers from coming down. Therefore, when they arrived at the city gates, the Jiaoji soldiers with torches became their targets. Every time a gunshot rang out, a figure would fall to the ground. After a dozen Jiaoji soldiers with torches were killed, the other Jiaoji soldiers learned their lesson. They extinguished the torches in their hands and found a corner to hide. The strength of the mercenaries had completely frightened them. At this moment, not to mention rushing down the city gates, they didn't even have the courage to stand up and check the situation. The 3 city gates fell into the hands of the scout company just like that. As the 4 city gates, the general's residence and the barracks were controlled, the Leng Feng platoons and the scout company had basically taken control of the entire Yinglu city. The 5,000 Lansong reinforcements who were completely unaware of all this were still rushing forward with all their might. As they got further and further away from Yinglu city, as they got closer and closer to the place where General Ati was ambushed, sporadic and light gunshots finally entered their ears. "Quick, it's right in front." The Chili Arch who reported the news pointed at the battlefield 2 to 3 li away and shouted loudly, "The enemy's reinforcements are here." In the dense forest, the 2nd Battalion Commander Chen Bo used his night vision binoculars and saw this scene. He then said to the messenger beside him, "Inform the 2nd Company to open up an opening and let these people in. Tell them they are allowed to enter but not leave. If one escapes, I will punish him." "Yes, Battalion Commander," the correspondent replied before turning around and running out. Not long after, the second company opened up an opening and the 5,000 Lansong soldiers charged into the encirclement. At the same time, they stepped into the gates of hell. Why is it so quiet? The moment they entered, the 5,000 reinforcements felt a sense of fear spread through their bodies. Logically speaking, there were close to 100,000 Lansong soldiers here. Even 100,000 pigs couldn't be killed in such a short amount of time. Furthermore, these were young and strong soldiers with their own thoughts. The moment this thought flashed through their minds, reality told them the answer. Behind them, dense gunshots rang out from the left and right. The 5,000 reinforcements who became the target became the center of the battlefield at this moment, becoming the point where the bullets poured out. The original Lansong soldiers already had experience after many people died. That was, if they could sit, they definitely wouldn't stand. If they could lie down, they definitely wouldn't sit. Therefore, when 5,000 targets suddenly appeared on the battlefield, it was obvious what would happen. There was no need to aim too much. After all, the 5,000 people standing there were too obvious a target. The gunshots were already continuous. Extinguish the torches and lie down on the ground. The Chiliarch, who was lying on the ground like an ostrich, saw that at least a few hundred of his brothers had died in a very short amount of time. At the same time, he couldn't help but cry out loudly. Fortunately, his reaction was very fast. After getting up and shouting, he immediately lay down on the ground again. A bullet whistled past his head. He was so scared that his heartbeat quickened. He really didn't dare to imagine what would have happened if he had been a step slower. In the end, this shout was still effective. Some soldiers still heard it and threw away their torches and lay down on the ground. Although the bullets whistled past their heads from time to time, it was no longer a threat to their lives. The 5,000 reinforcements quietened down after a few hundred people died. The battlefield fell silent once more. At this moment, no one wanted to challenge or test anything. They all lay down on the ground obediently, allowing the rain to soak their bodies. Fortunately, it was only August and the night wasn't too cold. Otherwise, it would be really hard to imagine what would happen if they lay down like this for the entire night. Battalion commander, they have all become obedient. A soldier who was very close to Chenbo looked at the scene in front of him and said with a face full of excitement. Previously, when the soldiers of the 2nd Battalion knew that they had to deal with the 100,000 Lansong soldiers alone, it was impossible for them not to be nervous. Although it was true that they had the most advanced firearms in the world, the difference in numbers was still too great. Even with the assistance of 10,000 Jiaoji mercenaries, most of the soldiers still didn't have the confidence to kill the enemy. Chapter 521. Until now, seeing that the Lansong soldiers were scared out of their wits, their morale was completely gone. They were like obedient sheep lying on the ground without moving. Only then did they relax. The joy of victory also boosted the morale of the soldiers and increased their confidence. That's right, they've all become obedient. Chen Bo said with a satisfied expression. Although his plan was thorough and he was confident that he would obtain the final victory, before there was a result, any accidents could happen. Thinking about the military order he made in front of the 6th young master, it would be a lie to say that he wasn't worried at all. Fortunately, the heavens were on his side. This light rain came at the right time. Finally, the situation was settled. He could also give a satisfactory answer to the 6th young master. He was happy in his heart and a smile appeared on his face. How about this? Notify everyone to take turns to rest. Let everyone recover their energy. There will be a bigger test waiting for us at dawn. Right now, they were just surrounding these people. As for whether they could take them all down, there were still many things to be done. Of course, the next battle wasn't a big battle. As long as everything went according to plan, it was obvious what choice these 100,000 people would make. When people were sleeping, time would often pass very quickly. However, it was also night time. Lying in the water and lying in the mud, that feeling was completely different. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that a day felt like a year. No matter if they were lying down or lying down, the feeling of being soaked in the rain wouldn't be too good. Not to mention, the light rain didn't seem to have any intention of stopping. Not only that, there was a moderate rain in the middle of the night. That feeling was really uncomfortable. Even so, no one couldn't endure it, because everyone knew that if they dared to stand up at this time, they would definitely become the target of the muskets. The worst thing was that even if they stood up, they didn't know where to run to. Originally, they had retreated by running all the way back. Their bodies were very tired. In addition, they didn't eat much. Under the hunger and sleepiness, their spirits were not good. In such an environment, they could not sleep even if they wanted to. Thus, when the sun began to rise, the morale of the 100,000 Lan-Tsang army had already dropped to the lowest point. The summer days were long to begin with, so the sun rose earlier in the morning. The mercenaries who surrounded them only slept for a little more than 2 hours before they had to wake up. Fortunately, they were able to sleep well for the past 2 days. In addition, they were prepared. Every soldier was wearing a raincoat. In terms of mental state, they were much better than the Lan-Tsang soldiers. From the moment the sky started to brighten, the mercenaries held their guns tightly in their hands, ready for the Lan-Tsang soldiers to counterattack. However, it was obvious that this was unnecessary. Tired, sleepy, and hungry, the soldiers of the Lan-Tsang kingdom had long lost the courage to resist. They did not know where to escape to, nor did they know where to go. In such a situation, even though lying on the ground was very uncomfortable, they could only do so. It's about time. Seeing that the expected riot did not happen, 2nd Battalion Commander Chen Bo heaved a sigh of relief. He stood up and his eyes shone. Pass down the order. The cooking squad can start working now. About an hour later, bursts of fragrance began to spread in all directions. When this fragrance entered the noses of the surrounded Lan-Tsang soldiers, it caused many of their bodies to move. When a person was very hungry, even the food that they usually disdained to eat would be very delicious. Furthermore, under the orders of Battalion Commander Chen Bo, the cooking squad put a lot of fresh meat in their breakfast. When the smell of the meat soup floated in the air, it only increased their appetite. Under the temptation of the meat soup, many Lan-Tsang soldiers forced themselves to look into the distance. What they saw were groups of soldiers in camouflage uniforms and some soldiers in Jiaoji army uniforms queuing up to get food. These soldiers had a big bowl in their left hand and a big bun in their right hand. They were drinking the soup and eating the bun, looking extremely happy. Rumble! At this moment, someone's stomach rumbled. When this rumbling sound rang out, no one laughed at him. On the contrary, when everyone looked into the distance, they could not help but swallow their saliva. It was clear that this scene was not small to them. After another hour, the mercenaries took turns to eat a hot breakfast. To them, in the 3 days that they were hiding here, they had been eating instant noodles, ham sausages, and all kinds of canned food. Although it was not a problem to fill their stomachs, it was not as good as eating hot food. The mercenaries all ate a hot breakfast and were all full. Then, they returned to their respective teams and continued their surveillance work. The only difference was that the pots that were cooking the soup didn't seem to have any intention of stopping. Under the dozens of temporary tents, the soup was still steaming, and the aroma was everywhere. When a new pot of broth had been boiled, and a new pot of steamed buns had been piled up, 2nd Battalion Commander Chen Bo took out a simple loudspeaker and began to broadcast his voice. Soldiers of Lan-Tsang Kingdom, I believe that many of you can understand what I am saying. Of course, if you don't understand, it's fine. You can ask the people around you who understand Chinese. Standing on top of a tall post with one hand on his waist and the other holding a megaphone, Chen Bo shouted loudly. Lan-Tsang Kingdom was the Lao's protector of the Great Ming Dynasty. Naturally, there was no lack of people who understood Chinese. Because of the influence, there were very few people who did not understand Chinese. Noticing that everyone was looking at him, Chen Bo first laughed and then continued to shout, "Soldiers of Lan-Tsang Kingdom, there are only 2 paths in front of you. The first is to stubbornly resist and die. The second is to immediately surrender and live. I won't say anything to those who want to die. You can try to charge out and see if your speed is faster or if our guns are faster. As for the brothers who want to live, you can walk out of the ranks now, lay down your weapons, and surrender. You can drink hot meat soup and eat hot buns. Your lives will be preserved, and the only thing you will lose is your temporary freedom. Otherwise, don't think about playing tricks with us. If anyone wants to fake surrender, I can guarantee that he will suffer a fate worse than death. Alright, whether you live or die is in front of you. Make your own choice. Passing the megaphone in his hand to the signaler, Chen Bo waved his hand and 2,000 Jiaoji mercenaries walked out. Each of them held a long blade in their hands. 200 people in a group stood beside a large pot, ready to accept any surrender at any time. 10,000 people wanting to subdue 100,000 enemy soldiers. It was like a fantasy story. After a night of rain, coupled with the fact that he was tired and hungry, Chen Bo did it just like that. Without any fighting spirit, the 100,000 Lan Song soldiers without a leader were like docile little sheep. Seeing a tiger open its bloody mouth, they could only surrender. One by one, the Lan Song soldiers climbed up from the ground in a sorry state. Their bodies were covered in mud as they walked over weakly. Of course, even if it was 100,000 broken soldiers, it was still 100,000 lives. If they were not careful, it could lead to irreversible consequences. In order to ensure that these surrendered soldiers were obedient, the surrounding Lung Feng and auxiliary soldiers no longer hid. Instead, they took the initiative to walk out. From time to time, they would even fire a shot into the sky to intimidate the surrendered soldiers who had other ideas. It was clear that Chen Bo was overthinking things. Under the starvation, the Lan Song soldiers who had lost their fighting spirit only thought of one thing, and that was to survive. How could they dare to have other thoughts? Furthermore, if they wanted to surrender, they had to throw away the weapons in their hands. If they did not even have weapons to defend themselves, how could they resist? Just like that, the surrender ceremony of less than 100,000 soldiers went unexpectedly smoothly. What made Chen Bo very satisfied was that there was also news from Yinglu City. Su Yunsheng and the Spring Sun Company commander did not disappoint him and successfully took down the city. The surrender ceremony was also going smoothly in the morning. Shiyu City. All kinds of information were gathered in the hands of the sixth young master, Yang Chendong. After knowing that Commander Nyetong's plan to lure the enemy was successful and that Lei Xiai's troops had returned to Yinglu City, Yang Chendong knew that the Lan Song Kingdom's reinforcements would not be a hindrance to his advance. Even if Chen Bo could not imprison the 100,000 soldiers, he could at least defeat them. Young master, Commander Chen must have made his move last night. Tiger's man analyzed the information and came to the same conclusion. That's right. Yang Chendong agreed. Then he looked in the direction of Shiyu City and said, since Commander Chen has already made his move, then we should also have some progress on our side. Pass down the order, prepare to attack the city. The matter in Jiaoji needs to be resolved as soon as possible. At this point, Yang Chendong could not help but think of the information sent by the Security Bureau 2 days ago. The Southern Ming Imperial bodyguards actually went to Jianing and took away his fourth brother. Although from the information, the other party's attitude was still considered polite when doing this. However, Yang Chendong knew that Zhu Qizhen did not have the courage to lower his face. Therefore, he only took away his fourth brother and did not immediately do anything. To put it bluntly, Zhu Qizhen was targeting him. He wanted to use this as a warning. However, Yang Chendong was not too worried. Although he was a little worried about his fourth brother's safety, he believed that as long as nothing happened to him, Zhu Qizhen would not be so stupid as to go against his fourth brother. After all, killing Yang Chendong would not benefit Yingzong at all. It would only force Yang Chendong to rebel. Chapter 522. Since he could see this, Zhu Qizhen should be able to see it as well. Even fourth brother was taken away, so it could be seen that Zhu Qizhen was afraid of him. In order to suppress his development, Yingzong would definitely think of ways to stop him from expanding. It wouldn't be long before the imperial edict arrived. In other words, he didn't have much time left. Tiger's mane, tell Yang San to think of a way to stop the imperial eunuch. I don't want to see them so soon. Understood. Tiger's mane replied and left. When he gave the order to prepare for the siege, he also called the deputy chief of the security bureau, Yang San, over. On the west side of the city, there were many armored soldiers, and the atmosphere was tense. The Lan Song Kingdom's 100,000 reinforcements suddenly retreated, which gave King Lili a bad feeling. Even though he had yet to figure out what had happened, he knew that Jiaoji was in grave danger this time. In fact, until now, the Jiaoji Kingdom's communication with the outside world had been cut off. All they could see was what was happening in front of them. Although there was no information from the outside world, as the king of Li, who had once wrestled with the great Ming dynasty, his formidable potential was displayed. He summoned all the civil and military officials and said with certainty, "The mercenaries should be attacking soon. We should also be prepared." There weren't many people who dared to oppose Li's words. Crown Prince Li Yuanlong was one of them. Seeing that his father didn't have any information and didn't have any reliable information, he said with a doubtful tone, "Father, why do you say that?" His son was good at everything, but he was a little too confident. With this kind of personality, he wouldn't easily trust others, even if he was his father. In truth, Li Yuanlong still valued his father very much. It was just that he had made some bad decisions in the past, especially when his base of operations in the Nine Truth County had been occupied. This had caused his personality to change a little. He always wanted to prove himself, which led to this problem. If others asked, perhaps Li wouldn't give any explanation. After all, he was the king, and he didn't need to consider other people's opinions when making decisions. But the one who asked this question was his son, so everything was a different story. He tried his best to speak in an amiable tone. Father made this decision based on two judgments. First, the Lan Song Kingdom's 100,000 reinforcements suddenly retreated. Although we still don't know the reason, their retreat must be caused by the mercenaries. This proves that they are preparing to make a move. 2. Extending the second finger of his right hand, King Li continued, "The diplomatic group we sent to contact the southern Ming has already left for a long time. Even the news of the capital being occupied has been sent out for a period of time. Presumably, the current emperor of the southern Ming dynasty should also know about what happened here. Since the mercenaries have such a strong fighting strength, I'm sure that not only us, but also the young emperor of the southern Ming dynasty. Unless there was something wrong with his brain, he would definitely think of a way to stop the mercenaries from growing stronger. If the mercenaries don't make a move now, I'm afraid that they won't have a chance to do anything once the emperor's imperial edict is issued." It had to be said that Li's intelligence was indeed very high, and his analysis was also very thorough. This was indeed one of the reasons why Yang Chendong was in a hurry to make a move. Of course, Li didn't know that the second reason why Yang Chendong was in a hurry to make a move was because he didn't want to waste too much time on conquering the Jiaoji kingdom. The destruction of a kingdom was a huge matter for the generals and even the monarchs in ancient times. It might even take a long time to prepare for this battle. Even if it took 10, 20, or even longer, it would take several generations of people to work together. However, all of this didn't mean much to Yang Chendong, who had mastered the advanced firearms. Although his strength wasn't too strong right now, it was still possible to win against the great Ming dynasty, but it was impossible to easily conquer the Jiaoji kingdom. After all, the great Ming dynasty's territory was too big, to the point that the people in his hands wouldn't even make a splash. In comparison, Jiaoji was different. It was only a small kingdom, and he was already prepared to conquer it. It must be known that Yang Chendong's ambition was so big that it was impossible for others to understand. Even so, if he had to spend so much time and effort on a small kingdom like Jiaoji, it would be impossible for him to achieve his goal in this lifetime. If he had to spend so much effort on such a small kingdom, what would he do when he faced the big kingdoms? As such, Yang Chendong didn't want to wait any longer. He wanted to make a swift and decisive decision and quickly resolve the matter of Jiaoji. In this way, even if others were dissatisfied with what he had done, what else could they say when he had done all that he had to do? No matter what Yang Chendong was thinking, at least Li's analysis was correct. After he explained the two reasons, even Crown Prince Li Yuanlong was convinced. He then said, "Father, since this is the case, should we prepare to fight? Of course we should fight, but we also need to make preparations for peace talks. Li nodded first, then shook his head and said with a sorrowful tone, "Our Jiaoji is still too weak. We can't continue fighting this war. Otherwise, even if the mercenaries don't destroy us, the others won't let us go." After saying this, Li said with a somewhat angry voice, "Send someone to investigate the assassination of the Duchess of Zhongdang. What is going on? That assassin is called Mo Ta, right? What is his background?" Hearing his father mention this matter, Crown Prince Li Yuanlong immediately reported what he knew. "Father, I have sent someone to investigate Mo Ta's matter. Although he is from Jiaoji, he is no longer under our control. We have been wrongly accused. Of course this prince knows this, but we still need to give him an explanation. How about this? Let's investigate this matter thoroughly." Li said with a dark expression. Mo Ta tried to assassinate Yang Chendong's wife but was killed before he could succeed. This didn't seem like a big deal. However, it had now become the fuse that ignited the war. If this matter wasn't resolved, the mercenaries wouldn't retreat so easily. Even if it was to give the other party a way out, this matter had to be investigated thoroughly. "Yes, I understand." Li Yuanlong nodded after understanding his father's intentions. "All right, boys, it's time for you to perform. If the mercenaries attack, this king hopes that everyone can give it their all. Only with a perfect performance on the battlefield can the negotiations proceed smoothly. Only then can our Jiaoji kingdom regain its strength and return to its golden age." "Yes." All the civil and military officials lowered their heads in agreement. They knew what would happen to them if they lost the next battle. Becoming a prisoner was probably the best outcome for him. Thinking that they would lose their freedom and all the pleasures of life, it was no wonder that everyone would do their best. Just as the Jiaoji army was preparing, the mercenaries 10 li outside the city started moving forward. 18,000 Jiaoji mercenaries lined up on both sides. The 3 battalions of the Cold Vanguard were at the front as the main force. Beside them were 7 auxiliary battalions and behind them were 7 temporary auxiliary battalions. The army of 25,000 slowly moved forward in an orderly manner. From the original distance of 10 miles to 9 miles, 8 miles, all the way until they were 4 miles away before they finally came to a stop. Facing the mercenaries who were eyeing them covetously, the Jiaoji army in Shiyu City quickly reacted. General Li Shaozhong was the vanguard. He led 30,000 soldiers out of the East City Gate and began to get into formation. If the mercenaries dared to move forward, they would charge forward and fight to the death. Li Shaozhong wasn't a general in the Jiaoji army and wasn't a famous general. However, King Li still sent him out as the vanguard. It was obvious that he was testing the waters. At the same time, he seemed to be telling Yang Chendong that he didn't intend to fight to the death. If there was anything, they could sit down and discuss it. How could Yang Chendong not see the goodwill shown by the Jiaoji army? Not only did he see it, but the people around him also felt the same way. For example, the commander of the 2nd Battalion, Luope, smiled and said, "6th young master, it seems like they're a bit scared." Ha! Hearing the commander's words, the other officers also laughed loudly. Yang Chendong also had a smile on his face. However, the smile quickly disappeared and was replaced with determination. "Send 2 auxiliary battalions. Let's take care of them first." Fear wasn't the result Yang Chendong wanted. Looking at the history of China, weren't many foreign races like this? When you are weak, they will bully you without any hesitation. When you are strong, they will try to please you with a fearful look. This is the nature of human nature. The difference was that Yang Chendong wasn't as magnanimous. Of course, he wasn't magnanimous. Speaking of which, he was very vengeful. Since they wanted to participate in the Great Ming's internal strife, they had to be prepared to go for wool and come home shorn. There was no such thing as a free lunch in the world. If you wanted to punch someone, you wouldn't let them hit you. Chapter 523. Initially, everyone was worried that the sixth young master would take pity on them for showing weakness. After all, as soldiers, the battlefield was the best place to test themselves. If there were no more battles to fight, their presence would only get weaker and weaker. Now, Yang Chendong did not relent because of their actions. He still decided to fight first. The 7 battalion commanders of the auxiliary battalions were all agitated. However, it was a pity that there were only 2 slots. In an instant, the 7 battalions were fighting over them. Lu Zhuo was also having a headache over the fact that there were clearly not enough slots to go around. Speaking of which, the 7 battalions were not too far apart in terms of fighting strength. It was not easy to choose who to send. After asking for instructions from Yang Chendong, they decided to draw lots to decide who to send. Of course, Lu Zhuo also said that if they were lucky enough to be sent but did not perform well on the battlefield, they would be sent to the sidelines the next time something like this happened. At most, they would be sent to the second echelon. The lucky ones were the 5th and 6th battalions. However, the other battalions were not without hope. As long as they did not perform well, it would be time for them to fight. In order not to give the other battalions a chance, the 5th and 6th battalion commanders gathered their company commanders, platoon commanders, and even squad leaders to hold an emergency meeting. In their words, if anyone messed up in the upcoming battle, they could not blame them for being ruthless and directly expelling them from the military. This was expelling them from the military, not just retirement. The latter would at least not be in the military anymore. They could still do other things. Moreover, with a military background, many units in Chichen City would fight for them. However, if they were really expelled from the military, they would be too ashamed to face anyone. That would be even more painful than death. Yes, the 2 battalions had a total of 800 soldiers. Every one of them was yelling and shouting, looking as though they were going to give it their all. In terms of logistics, the soldiers of the 2 battalions had a decent lunch of 6 meat and 2 vegetables. After resting for 15 minutes, the 800 soldiers leaped over the 3rd battalion of the Cold Front Battalion and slowly approached the 30,000 Jiaoji soldiers outside the city. No matter where the Cold Front Battalion went, they were the absolute main force. However, they had no intention of fighting the first battle, which made the company commanders below look displeased. First Company Commander Tian Su went straight to Battalion Commander Kong Chuanxin to express his dissatisfaction. Battalion Commander, why didn't you let us fight in the first battle? Does the 6th young master have something against us? Bullshit. Kong Chuanxin frowned after hearing this and shouted, bullshit. In comparison, Kong Chuanxin's temper was relatively good among the 3 battalion commanders of Cold Front's 2nd Regiment. Although he didn't have the aura of a scholarly general like that of 2nd Battalion Commander Qinbo, he was at least much better than 1st Battalion Commander Wu Sheng, who was a martial artist. However, at this moment, he couldn't help but curse. He couldn't be blamed for his temper. He was already upset that he hadn't used him in the first battle. He originally thought that the 1st Battalion was still in Langsun, waiting for the Jiaoji army to retreat, while the 2nd Battalion was outside Yinglu City, dealing with the 100,000 Lansong army. Naturally, the heavy responsibility of attacking Nanyu City would fall to him. He had even made preparations to mobilize his troops before the battle. However, who would have thought that the 6th young master wouldn't use them in the first battle and instead sent out 2 auxiliary battalions? This disappointed him and made him angry. Now that the company commanders below were looking for him, it would be strange if he was in a good mood. Although he was angry, Kong Chuanxin knew that he couldn't bring his temper into the army. Therefore, after cursing, he said, "Don't think too much. The 6th young master definitely wants to use the steel on the blade. Don't you know that the enemy's general is just a nobody in the Jiaoji army? Against them, there's no need for a main force like us to fight. Therefore, we should be prepared to fight against their main force. That's what the Cold Front should be doing." Kong Chuanxin's thoughts were exactly what Yang Chendong was thinking. However, they were facing 30,000 Jiaoji soldiers, and they weren't even the strongest. They didn't see any iron shield soldiers or iron chariots. The enemy wasn't even the elephant soldiers or black soldiers. Why would he send out his strongest main force? Sending out 2 auxiliary battalions was already giving them a lot of face. Although it seemed like there was a huge gap between 800 and 20,000, Yang Chendong wasn't worried at all. The mercenaries had the most advanced firearms in the world. As long as they didn't rush over to fight the enemy in close combat, they had a high chance of winning even if they had 800 against 20,000. Just like in the later stages of the Ming dynasty, the small slave builders only had a few hundred cavalrymen and they were able to kill tens of thousands of Ming dynasty soldiers. If even they could do it, the mercenaries wouldn't have a problem. Back to the main topic. The 800 soldiers from the 2 auxiliary battalions walked out from the mercenaries and approached the Jiaoji army. Young Master Li was riding on his horse. When he saw that less than 1,000 mercenaries had walked out, he couldn't help but laugh coldly. These mercenaries are too arrogant. Do they really think that they are made of iron and can't be killed? Trying to shake my 30,000-strong army with less than 1,000 men? You are asking for death. I'll grant you your wish. Men, blow the battle horn. Charge and kill them. Although Li Xiaozhong knew that the mercenaries were equipped with advanced firearms, he quickly suppressed his fear when he considered the fact that he had an advantage in numbers. As the order was given, the 30,000 Jiaoji army advanced step by step under the sharp sound of the battle horn. There were more than 10,000 soldiers, and there was no end to them. Outside the east gate of Shiyu City, when the 30,000 soldiers were spread out, the pressure they exuded was immense. At the very least, these Jiaoji soldiers were emboldened by this aura. With every step they took, they shouted the word kill. Their voices reverberated between heaven and earth, lingering for a long time without dissipating. On the east gate tower of Shiyu City, King Li and the Crown Prince were watching. When they saw that the mercenaries had sent out less than 1,000 men, they couldn't help but look down on them. Most of them were thinking that even if the mercenaries had advanced weapons, they were still too arrogant to use only 800 to fight 30,000. As long as these people charged in front of them, they would be able to kill the mercenaries with just a spit of saliva. Indeed, many Jiaoji people had such thoughts. On the other hand, the mercenaries also had the same thought. It was time for the auxiliary soldiers to show off their might. When the 30,000 Jiaoji soldiers began to move forward, the 800 auxiliary soldiers stopped moving. Then, one by one, the soldiers checked their weapons and ammunition. In just 10 seconds, all the soldiers picked up their guns and looked forward. In fact, they had already checked their weapons countless times before they arrived. Their actions just now were subconscious. 5th Battalion, target 6 to 12 o'clock. Get ready. 6th Battalion, target 12 to 6 o'clock. Get ready. The 2 auxiliary battalion commanders gave the command to prepare for battle at the same time. 800 soldiers stood in the same line, giving the impression of a long green dragon entrenched on the ground. Open fire. The distance between the two sides was now only 400 meters, completely within the firing range of the muskets. The 2 battalion commanders immediately gave the order to open fire, and a series of gunshots instantly suppressed the other party's footsteps and sounds. Bullets flew out horizontally. When the 8-Nation Alliance entered Beijing, there were only 1,000 of them. However, they were able to defeat tens of thousands of Qing soldiers and the Boxer groups. This was the power of firearms. At that time, the 8-Nation Alliance mostly used rifles, the kind that needed to be reloaded after every shot. Moreover, the effective range of those rifles was only 200 to 300 meters. In comparison, it was much worse than the Type 81 rifles used by the auxiliary soldiers. Even though the Type 81 rifles were made by the Qiqian City Munitions Factory, they were not as good as the Type 81 rifles in Yang Chendong's warehouse. However, there were all kinds of detailed introduction books and the best finished products as templates. The Type 81 rifles produced by the munitions factory were quite good, reaching 70% of the original gun's effect. At the very least, although the Type 81 rifle's effective killing range did not reach the original 800 meters, it could reach the current 500 meters. Currently, at a distance of 400 meters, every bullet could take a person's life. Of course, when facing a black mass of enemies, there was no need to aim. Any bullet that was fired, as long as it did not hit the sky or the ground, could hit someone. Gunshots rang out. When 800 Type 81 rifles were fired at the same time, the scene was very shocking. As their bullets poured out from the barrels of their guns, their enemies, the Jiaoji soldiers who came from afar, fell to the ground in droves. Previously, they relied on their numbers and were full of morale. Even when they took a step forward and shouted the word, "Kill," it was indeed effective in raising their morale. However, at the end of the day, it was just to encourage themselves. When faced with life and death, no one knew if this courage would be useful. Every time a bullet was fired, a Jiaoji soldier would fall to the ground. When such things happened one after another without any signs of stopping, even if they still had the courage to shout the word, "Kill," in reality, they were already afraid. There was no one who was not afraid of death, especially when they knew that they were going to die. They did not even have the mentality to try their luck. One could imagine what kind of blow the morale of the army was taking. Under the shock of the advanced rifles, the morale of the Jiaoji soldiers began to drop. As the figures fell, the Jiaoji soldiers had only advanced 50 meters before they began to stagnate. Some of the more cowardly ones even began to tremble, wondering if they should retreat and run. Chapter 524. Death was scary to some people, but to do it despite knowing that death was inevitable would only make it even scarier. Idiot charge! On top of the city gate tower, Crown Prince Li Yuanlong watched his soldiers die one by one under the mercenaries' guns. In fact, there were hundreds of people paying the price with their lives every breath. It would be a lie to say that he did not feel heartache. However, since they had already charged, there was no turning back. Since that was the case, they should be thinking about how to achieve victory. Without a doubt, how were they going to charge past the hundreds of enemies? The most important thing was to engage in close combat and reduce the effectiveness of the enemy's firearms. Perhaps to prove the Crown Prince's words, the commanding general below the city wall, Li Shaozhong, happened to give the order for the entire army to charge. He continued to shout the battle cry, and at the same time he shouted to the people around him in a bewitching manner, "They only have 800 people. As long as we can rush to their side, victory will belong to us. Charge! Whoever kills one enemy will be promoted by 3 ranks, and will be rewarded with 100 taels of silver." With such a great reward, brave men were bound to come forward. Especially when Li Shaozhong killed a few soldiers who wanted to retreat, the other Jiaoji soldiers gritted their teeth and charged forward. That's right, once they charged forward, the firearms in the hands of the mercenaries would not be as effective. That would be the time for them to kill the enemy. Retreat! Seeing that the enemy had finally come to their senses and knew how to charge, the 2 commanding generals of the Jiaoji battalion immediately ordered. At the same time, the soldiers of the 5th and 6th battalions gave the order to retreat. At the same time, the guns in their hands continued to spit out flames and bullets. Jiaoji soldiers kept falling in the path of the charge. However, because one side was charging with full force while the other side was retreating, the distance between the 2 sides was slowly closing as more and more people died. First platoon, activate continuous fire mode. Fire all your bullets quickly. Second platoon, third platoon, prepare to fire. Seeing that the distance between the 2 sides had been reduced from 400 meters to less than 100 meters, and soon it was only 60 to 70 meters, and the distance was still rapidly shrinking, the 5th and 6th battalion commanders issued a new order. It would be a lie to say that they were not afraid when facing the charge of tens of thousands of people with only 800 people. After all, the momentum of so many people rushing over was very frightening. Fortunately, their usual training was effective. Yang Chendong had long anticipated that they would often be outnumbered, so when he trained them, he placed special emphasis on courage. The lone hero had become the role model and goal in the hearts of all the warriors. In addition, the 2 battalion commanders had already said that if anyone dropped the ball, they would face the consequences of being expelled from the army. After all, the 6th young master was watching from behind. As a member of the auxiliary troops, it was rare for him to be in the limelight like this. If he retreated out of fear, or even ran away, he would lose all his face. It was under such encouragement that none of the soldiers retreated even though they were still a little afraid. Instead, they listened to the orders of the 2 battalion commanders. They opened fire and dropped bombs. Everything seemed to be in order. Seeing that the mercenaries were getting closer and closer, the eyes of the Jiaoji soldiers at the front glowed with excitement. In their eyes, victory was right in front of them. As long as they advanced a few dozen meters, as long as they could get close to the mercenaries, the effects of their firearms would be limited. That would be the time for them to show off their might. Dreams were beautiful, but reality was cruel. Just as these Jiaoji soldiers were trying their best to run forward and seemed to have seen the light at the end of the tunnel, hundreds of objects suddenly flew over their heads. Those objects seemed to have grown eyes as they landed in the midst of the charging Jiaoji soldiers. In the next moment, a series of deafening explosions were heard. Correspondingly, Jiaoji soldiers were blown away by the explosions. Grenades could be considered as small cannons for close combat. Once they landed in a crowd, the impact was so great that everything within a 3-meter radius would be flattened. The pitiful Jiaoji soldiers at the front were instantly devoured by the power of the gunpowder. Tot-tot. The Type 81 rifles of the 2 auxiliary platoons were in continuous firing mode. In that instant, bullets rained down on the Jiaoji soldiers. Some of the Jiaoji soldiers who were lucky enough not to be hit by the grenades became live targets. One by one, they were hit by the bullets and fell to the ground. Grenades, throw them. With each squad as a unit, the sounds of explosions were incessant. While corpses were sent flying, deep craters of varying sizes were blasted into the ground. No one knew which Jiaoji soldier was the first to shout, but the Jiaoji army that was charging forward with an aggressive momentum finally began to retreat. Especially when some of the soldiers realized that the explosive objects that were thrown on the ground had a limited range, they began to run even faster. The initial wave of ferocious attacks was thus suppressed. Chase and fire at the same time. Seeing an opportunity, the 5th and 6th battalion commanders put away their grenades and raised their guns to give chase. The Jiaoji soldiers behind them who were too slow to escape fell to the ground one by one. In the middle of the mercenary army, Yang Chundong observed all of this with his binoculars. A look of relief appeared on his face. Just a moment ago, he had already planned to send the other auxiliary battalions and even the main battalion of the Cold Front. After all, if the Jiaoji soldiers had really reached them, the consequences would have been unimaginable. Such a loss was not something he wanted to see. Fortunately, the 2 auxiliary battalions did not disappoint him. They withstood the initial pressure and won the final victory. Of course, facing such an attack, Yang Chundong actually had a better idea. For example, he could casually take out a few powerful cannons from the warehouse. When the cannons were fired, the enemy's attack would be instantly neutralized. However, he did not do so in the end. He was not worried about how to explain the sudden appearance of the cannons. After all, the Cold Front soldiers had already treated him as a god. He did not need to explain anything to anyone. What he was worried about was that if he used the cannons this time, what about the next time? When he was not on the battlefield, what would happen if the mercenaries wanted to attack the city or even destroy the country? It was impossible to have the help of the cannons every time. Without chariots, not to mention the difficulty of transporting such a thing, if such a treasure fell into the hands of the enemy, the consequences would be fatal. Of course, it was necessary to use the cannons appropriately. After all, the Cold Front would need to be equipped with a certain number of cannons in the future. However, even if they were to be used, they would have to be used on the blade. On the battlefield, as the mercenaries retreated, the 2 auxiliary battalions began to counterattack. Although their footsteps were not very fast, because the enemy was still within shooting range of the 81 caliber guns, every time they fired, there would still be enemies who would fall to the ground. Open the city gates and let them in. On the tower of Shiyu City, seeing the defeated Jiaoji soldiers being slaughtered right under his nose, the king of Lily's face was already pale. He suddenly realized that he seemed to be really old. He actually began to feel fear from the bottom of his heart. This was something that had never happened to him when he was young. Even when he was facing the powerful Ming dynasty, he still dared to make his own voice and arm wrestle. But now, in the face of the seemingly invincible mercenaries who were able to repel his 30,000-strong army with less than 1,000 people, he really didn't know what to do or what to do at this moment. On the tower, the Jiaoji archers began to continuously fire arrows. Although they were far from being able to hit the mercenaries who were still 400 meters away, they at least had to show that they had the ability to counterattack. The east city gate was already wide open, allowing General Li Shaozhong and his defeated soldiers to successfully enter the city. Although they were defeated, they were still Jiaoji soldiers after all. Needless to say, who would not be defeated when facing such an opponent? After the soldiers surged into the city gate, they did not even have time to care about the wounded soldier who was shot but did not die. The city gate was quickly closed. They were afraid that the mercenaries would take the opportunity to directly attack the city. However, in reality, the two auxiliary battalions had already retreated. In this battle, they had killed at least a few thousand people and successfully completed their mission. When the 5th and 6th battalion commanders returned to the barracks, they were naturally praised by Yang Chendong. He also announced that their contributions would be recorded and would be rewarded when the time was right. The two battalion commanders immediately received countless envious gazes. Although the other battalion commanders were also jealous, they knew that these two battalion commanders had some ability after witnessing everything. Just the fact that they were able to remain unmoved in the face of 10 times the enemy's pressure was already admirable. As for contributions, with so many enemies, was there a need to be afraid that there would not be any more battles to fight in the future? As long as one was strong enough, gold would always shine. After the battle, it was almost night time. Yang Chendong had no intention of launching a night attack. It was not that he did not have the ability to do so, but the current Jiaoji was not worth it for him to do so. Therefore, other than the soldiers who were left behind to carry out the necessary patrols, the rest of the soldiers went to bed early after dinner. Others could rest, but Yang Chendong could not. He still had too many things to do. For example, the 2nd Battalion commander, Qin Bo, had sent news that they had successfully completed their mission. They had killed General Ati of the Lansong Kingdom's reinforcements and more than 5,000 soldiers. The remaining 95,000 Lansong soldiers and 1,000 Jiaoji soldiers in Yinglu City had all become captives. After the first step was completed, Chen Bo asked for instructions on what to do next. In response, Yang Chendong gave the orders while Tiger's Mane recorded them down. Inform Hanoi City to send out 20,000 educated youths from Chichen City. Leave 2,000 of them in Yinglu City to carry out preaching activities. The rest will help Battalion Commander Chen to take the captives back. Inform the Navy to be prepared to send the captives to Chichen City. Chapter 525. After dealing with the matter of Yinglu City in a decisive manner, he picked up another piece of information to read. When he saw the information, Yang Chendong couldn't help but laugh coldly. The information came from the Southern Ming Empire's imperial palace. The person who sent the information was one of the chief eunuchs, Mao Mu. As the most important spy by Ying Zong's side, unless it was a major event, he wouldn't send out any information. Since the information came from him, it must be very important. Just like what was recorded in the information, Ying Zong actually listened to the opinions of his ministers and wanted to borrow money from Yang Chendong. The emperor of a country actually wanted to borrow money from his ministers. Wasn't this a very comical matter? However, it happened now, and Yang Chendong became the main character of this matter. Obviously, one of the ministers didn't like him and wanted to smear some medicine on him. In addition, the Southern Ming Empire had just separated and their foundation wasn't very solid. Then there was civil strife in the south. When they quelled the rebellion, they spent a lot of money. Now that they didn't have to pay taxes from Guangdong, Guangxi, and Yunnan, their lives were even more difficult. At this time, they had to recruit 1 million more soldiers. The amount of money they needed to spend was uncountable. The treasury was running out of money. Someone suggested that they could borrow money from Yang Chendong. After all, this person had set up a bank in Baiming. It was said that his savings had reached more than 40 million taels. It shouldn't be a problem to borrow 20 to 30 million taels. Zhu Qizhen, who was lacking money, felt that this seemed to be a feasible path after hearing the suggestions of his ministers. He decided to let the eunuch in charge of announcing the edict tell Yang Chendong to stop sending troops to Jiaoji. Then, he would ask him to lend money to the southern Ming Empire to tide over the current crisis. Mao Mu said this in the information. After being sent by the Security Bureau, the information was first placed in front of Yang Chendong. Seeing that this was simply wishful thinking, Hu Mang wanted to throw the report away the moment he saw it. However, considering that this matter was not known to the young master, once the imperial eunuch from the southern Ming Empire arrived, wouldn't he be unprepared? Thus, in the end, this piece of information still appeared in front of Yang Chendong. Now that he saw Yang Chendong laughing while holding the information, Tiger's Mane suggested, "Young master, I think Zhu Qizhen's head must have been kicked by a donkey. This is just wishful thinking. We don't have to pay attention to it." Yang Chendong also said that his head had been kicked by a donkey. He used it to describe those ignorant people who made ignorant decisions. When the mercenary officers heard it, they felt that the description was very appropriate, so they often used it. Hearing Tiger's Mane's suggestion, Yang Chendong tilted his head and looked at him. "Do you also think that Zhu Qizhen's head is rusty?" Seeing that Yang Chendong didn't seem to think so, Tiger's Mane said with a puzzled expression, "Young master, isn't that the case? Even an idiot can see that he wants to strengthen the southern Ming Empire. With our development, it is only a matter of time before we become enemies. If we help them now, isn't it the same as creating a powerful enemy for ourselves?" It was no wonder that Tiger's Mane said this. Originally, when Yang Chendong was building an army in Chichen City, they didn't understand the young master's intentions. After all, the great Ming Empire was too powerful in their eyes. They were so powerful that they couldn't be shaken. They didn't even dare to think about it. However, after wiping out the Huang bandit army and conquering several cities in Jiaoji, they changed their minds. With such a powerful army and heaven-defying firearms, why couldn't they set their sights on something bigger? Didn't the ancients say that it was better to be a king than a general? Since that was the case, why couldn't they dream about becoming an emperor? Moreover, the great Ming dynasty was originally snatched from the Yuan dynasty, so it seemed reasonable for someone else to snatch it away from them. It had to be said that Tiger's Mane wasn't the only one who had such thoughts. Many of the high-ranking officers in the mercenary army also had such thoughts. It could be said that this had already formed a certain scale. This way, if Yang Chendong wanted to attack the great Ming Empire one day, there wouldn't be any resistance. However, in Yang Chendong's eyes, this wasn't the case. At the very least, he knew that the so-called one day was still far away from him. As for the reason, of course, it was because of the population. Before solving this problem, Yang Chendong really didn't want to fall out with the great Ming Empire. Otherwise, who knew how much effort and time it would take to solve these problems? Towards the great Ming Empire, Yang Chendong naturally couldn't be like how he was towards Jiaoji, where he could destroy a country and kill people at will. If he didn't use such extreme methods, it would take too much effort and time to solve the great Ming Empire's problem. With the idea of easy first and difficult later, Yang Chendong decided to put the great Ming Empire's problem aside for now. As long as he was strong enough, he believed that one day he would be able to subdue the enemy without fighting. Since that was the case, he couldn't fall out with them. In other words, he really had to borrow money. Of course, lending money to the great Ming Empire wasn't all bad. For example, he could use this opportunity to raise some conditions. What did the great Ming Empire have the most? Naturally, it was the Han population. If he could use this to make a deal, Zhu Qizhen would definitely agree. If a large number of people could be used in an open and above-board manner, it would play a very positive role in accelerating the development of Crimson Castle, the entire Ryukyu Island, and even the entire Yang family's development. That was not something that could be achieved with just a few silver taels. In other words, The thing that Yang Chendong didn't lack the most right now was money. Putting aside the fact that the goods in the Outer Heavens Trading Company had always been in short supply, especially after the cooperation with the Walla, many things had begun to be exported to Europe and had become items that the rich people there fought to buy. Just based on this, silver was continuously sent to the Yang clan. Moreover, as the Yang clan's navy continued to grow stronger, the amount of transactions at sea was also increasing. In the warehouse in Crimson City, silver had long been piled up like a mountain. There was so much that he didn't even know how to spend it. If there was a chance in the future, Yang Chendong would consider using his own banknotes. After all, using silver as currency was somewhat wasteful. Just the silver itself would be consumed. Even with the assistance of the Yang clan's bank, the Yang clan's bank didn't exist everywhere. Banknotes weren't good for real circulation, but it would be much better if he could use banknotes instead. Of course, this was just an idea. There was still a lot of preparation work to be done. If it was done, the silver would be so much that he wouldn't be able to spend it all. He could lend it to the Great Ming Empire in exchange for a sufficient number of people. No matter how he looked at it, it was worth it. After having a rough idea in his mind, Yang Chendong put this matter aside. Since the person who was talking about this matter was the eunuch who came to announce the edict, it would take a long time for them to reach him. For now, it was more important to solve the problem of Jiaoji. Speaking of the problem of Jiaoji, Beta Persei, who was guarding outside the door, strode into the tent. When he saw Yang Chendong, he cupped his fists and said, "Young master, someone from Jiaoji is here. He says that he must see you." "Let him in." Yang Chendong's face was calm. This was within his expectations. After all, it was reasonable for them to send someone to negotiate when the enemy was about to arrive at the city gates. However, he didn't know what the other party would say. Beta Persei left and quickly returned to the tent, bringing in a man in his 30s. When the man entered the tent, he first sized up Yang Chendong. A look of surprise flashed across his eyes. Then he imitated the Han people and cupped his fists and said, "The Crown Prince of Jiaoji, Li Yuanlong, greets the Great Ming Empire's Duke of Loyalty." You're the Crown Prince of Jiaoji." When Tiger's Mane heard his name, he was shocked. Even Yang Chendong's eyes darkened. However, they quickly returned to normal. He didn't know how many enemies and countries he would have to face in the future. It was just a small Crown Prince of Jiaoji. He was very satisfied with Tiger's Mane's performance. Li Yuanlong nodded and said confidently, "That's right, I'm the Crown Prince of Jiaoji." The battle during the day had already proven the strength of the mercenaries. Everyone knew that if this battle were to continue, it was very likely that the Jiaoji army would be the one to lose. Imagine, how could you hurt your opponent when you couldn't even touch their body? If you lost on the battlefield, you had no choice but to negotiate. Although you might have to pay a high price, it was still better than being defeated or even killed. However, who would be sent to negotiate with Yang Chendong became a headache for King Li. Instead of calling it a negotiation, it would be more accurate to call it a truce. Naturally, the ministers were unwilling to do such a task. On the other hand, some courageous young ministers wanted to seize the opportunity. However, their status was too low. Not only would they be looked down upon during the negotiation, they wouldn't be able to make the decision on many matters. In the end, after much consideration, King Li's gaze fell on his son. Whether it was in terms of status or charisma, this son of the Crown Prince was the best choice. In fact, Li Yuanlong didn't disappoint his father. When he saw his father looking at him, he took the initiative to stand up and take on the responsibility. That was why he appeared in the mercenaries' tent. "You're quite brave." Tiger's Mane was still in shock. Of course, this was said by Yang Chendong. This couldn't be blamed on Tiger's Mane. In the past, he was just a study companion of the 6th young master. To put it bluntly, he was just a servant of the Yang family. With such a status, it was inevitable that he would feel uneasy when meeting the Crown Prince of a country. On the other hand, Yang Chendong had interacted with the northern and southern emperors of the Great Ming dynasty. Naturally, his horizons were broader. Although he was a little flustered by Tiger's Mane's appearance, he quickly calmed down. "You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.